Chapter 21, Persecution of Heresy, State of the Church. Part 1. Persecution of Heresy, the Schism of the Donatists, the Arian Controversy. Athanasius. Distracted state of the Church and Empire under Constantine and his sons. Toleration of Paganism. The grateful applause of the clergy has consecrated the memory of a prince who indulged their passions and promoted their interest. Constantine gave them security, wealth, honors, and revenge, and the support of the Orthodox faith was considered as the most sacred and important duty of the civil magistrate. The Edict of Milan, the great charter of toleration, had confirmed to each individual of the Roman world the privilege of choosing and professing his own religion. But this inestimable privilege was soon violated. With the knowledge of truth, the emperor imbibed the maxims of persecution, and the sects which dissented from the Catholic Church were afflicted and oppressed by the triumph of Christianity. Constantine easily believed that the heretics who presumed to dispute his opinions or to oppose his commands were guilty of the most absurd and criminal obstinacy, and that a seasonable application of moderate severities might save those unhappy men from the danger of an everlasting condemnation. Not a moment was lost in excluding the ministers and teachers of the separated congregations from any share of the rewards and immunities which the emperor had so liberally bestowed on the Orthodox clergy. But as the sectaries might still exist under the cloud of royal disgrace, the conquest of the East was immediately followed by an edict which announced their total destruction. Munt, after a preamble filled with passion and reproach, Constantine absolutely prohibits the assemblies of the heretics and confiscates their public property to the use either of the revenue or of the Catholic Church. The sects against whom the imperial severity was directed appear to have been the adherents of Paul of Samosata, the Montanists of Phrygia, who maintained an enthusiastic succession of prophecy, the Novatians, who sternly rejected the temporal efficacy of repentance, the Marcionites and Valentinians, under whose leading banners the various Gnostics of Asia and Egypt had insensibly rallied, and perhaps the Manichaeans, who had recently imported from Persia a more artful composition of Oriental and Christian theology. 2. The design of extirpating the name, or at least of restraining the progress, of these odious heretics was prosecuted with vigor and effect. Some of the penal regulations were copied from the edicts of Diocletian, and this method of conversion was applauded by the same bishops who had felt the hand of oppression and pleaded for the rights of humanity. Two immaterial circumstances may serve, however, to prove that the mind of Constantine was not entirely corrupted by the spirit of zeal and bigotry. Before he condemned the Manichaeans and their kindred sects, he resolved to make an accurate inquiry into the nature of their religious principles. As if he distrusted the impartiality of his ecclesiastical counselors, this delicate commission was entrusted to a civil magistrate, whose learning and moderation he justly esteemed, and of whose venal character he was probably ignorant. The emperor was soon convinced that he had too hastily prescribed the orthodox faith and the exemplary morals of the Novatians, who had dissented from the Church in some articles of discipline which were not perhaps essential to salvation. By a particular edict, he exempted them from the general penalties of the law, allowed them to build a church at Constantinople, respected the miracles of their saints, invited their bishop Athanasius to the Council of Nicaea, and gently ridiculed the narrow tenets of his sect by a familiar jest, which, from the mouth of a sovereign, must have been received with applause and gratitude. Fief to return. After some examination of the various opinions of Tillemont, Beausobre, Lagner, and C., I am convinced that Mainz did not propagate his sect, even in Persia, before the year 270. It is strange that a philosophic and foreign heresy should have penetrated so rapidly into the African provinces, yet I cannot easily reject the edict of Diocletian against the Manichaeans, which may be found in Baronius, AD 287. The Re-ine, the return, Constantinus, enim cum limatius superstitionum quaerorat sectas, Manichaeorum et similium, NN. XV 15, Strategius, who from this commission obtained the surname of Musonianus, was a Christian of the Arian sect. He acted as one of the counts at the Council of Nicaea. Libanius praises his mildness and prudence. Vales, ad locum amian, to 4, return, cod. Theod. 16, tit. 5, leg. As the general law is not inserted in the Theodosian Code, it probable that, in the year 438, the sects which it had condemned were already extinct. To 5 return, Manian C. Den, Asozomen, Lic. 22, Socrates, Lic. Den. These historians have been suspected, but I think without reason, of an attachment to the Novatian doctrine. The emperor said to the bishop, "Athanasius, take a ladder and get up to heaven by yourself." Most of the Christian sects have, by turns, borrowed the ladder of Athanasius. The complaints and mutual accusations which assailed the throne of Constantine, as soon as the death of Maxentius had submitted Africa to his victorious arms, were ill-adapted to edify an imperfect proselyte. He learned with surprise that the provinces of that great country, from the confines of Cyrene to the columns of Hercules, were distracted with religious discord. 6. The source of the division was derived from a double election in the Church of Carthage, the second, in rank and opulence, of the ecclesiastical thrones of the West. Caecilian and Majorinus were the two rival prelates of Africa, and the death of the latter soon made room for Donatus, who, by his superior abilities and apparent virtues, was the firmest support of his party. The advantage which Caecilian might claim from the priority of his ordination was destroyed by the illegal, or at least indecent, haste with which it had been performed, without expecting the arrival of the bishops of Numidia. The authority of these bishops, who, to the number of 70, condemned Caecilian and consecrated Maroninus, is again weakened by the infamy of some of their personal characters and by the female intrigues, sacrilegious bargains, and tumultuous proceedings which are imputed to this Numidian council. 7. The bishops of the contending factions maintained, with equal ardor and obstinacy, that their adversaries were degraded or at least dishonored by the odious crime of delivering the Holy Scriptures to the officers of Diocletian. From their mutual reproaches, as well as from the story of this dark transaction, it may justly be inferred that the late persecution had embittered the zeal, without reforming the manners, of the African Christians. That divided church was incapable of affording an impartial judicature. The controversy was solemnly tried in 5 successive tribunals, which were appointed by the emperor, and the whole proceeding, from the first appeal to the final sentence, lasted above 3 years. A severe inquisition, which was taken by the Praetorian Vicar and the proconsul of Africa, the report of 2 episcopal visitors who had been sent to Carthage, the decrees of the councils of Rome and of Arles, and the supreme judgment of Constantine himself in his sacred consistory, were all favorable to the cause of Caecilian, and he was unanimously acknowledged by the civil and ecclesiastical powers as the true and lawful primate of Africa. The honors and estates of the Church were attributed to his suffragan bishops, and it was not without difficulty that Constantine was satisfied with inflicting the punishment of exile on the principal leaders of the Donatist faction. As their cause was examined with attention, perhaps it was determined with justice. Perhaps their complaint was not without foundation, that the credulity of the emperor had been abused by the insidious arts of his favorite Osius. The influence of falsehood and corruption might procure the condemnation of the innocent or aggravate the sentence of the guilty. Such an act, however, of injustice, if it concluded an importunate dispute, might be numbered among the transient evils of a despotic administration, which are neither felt nor remembered by posterity. 6. To return. The best materials for this part of ecclesiastical history may be found in the edition of Optatus Milevitanus, published Paris, Puis Caris, 1700 by M. Restis, published Fouand and Seventin by M. Praetonat by Emra. Dupin, who has enriched it with critical notes, geographical discussions, original records, and an accurate abridgment of the whole controversy. M. de Tillemont has bestowed on the Donatists the greatest part of a volume, Tome, V.E., Part E.E., and I am indebted to him for an ample collection of all the passages of his favorite St. Augustine which relate to those heretics. Jupan return cisma igitur illo tempore, confure confuse mulieres iracundia peperit, ambitus nutrivit, e everitia roboravit. Optatus, Lic. 19. The language of Purpurius is that of a furious madman. Disciture necasse lilios, sororis tuae diurs. Purpurius respondit, putas me terreri ete, oxidi, et oxidiu e osci, contra me fatuon. Certanes, ad calc. Optat, p. 274. When Sicilian was invited to an assembly of bishops, Purpurius said to his brethren, or rather to his accomplices, "Let him come hither to receive our imposition of hands, and we will break his head by way of penance." Optat, Lic. 19. But this incident, so inconsiderable that it scarcely deserves a place in history, was productive of a memorable schism which afflicted the provinces of Africa above 300 years and was extinguished only with Christianity itself. The inflexible zeal of freedom and fanaticism animated the Donatists to refuse obedience to the usurpers, whose election they disputed and whose spiritual powers they denied. Excluded from the civil and religious communion of mankind, they boldly excommunicated the rest of mankind, who had embraced the impious party of Caecilian and of the Traditors, from which he derived his pretended ordination. They asserted with confidence and almost with exultation that the apostolical succession was interrupted, that all the bishops of Europe and Asia were infected by the contagion of guilt and schism, and that the prerogatives of the Catholic Church were confined to the chosen portion of the African believers, who alone had preserved inviolate the integrity of their faith and discipline. This rigid theory was supported by the most uncharitable conduct. Whenever they acquired a proselyte, even from the distant provinces of the East, they carefully repeated the sacred rites of baptism and ordination, as they rejected the validity of those which he had already received from the hands of heretics or schismatics. Bishops, virgins, and even spotless infants were subjected to the disgrace of a public penance before they could be admitted to the communion of the Donatists. If they obtained possession of a church which had been used by their Catholic adversaries, they purified the unhallowed building with the same zealous care which a temple of idols might have required. They washed the pavement, scraped the walls, burnt the altar, which was commonly of wood, melted the consecrated plate, and cast the Holy Eucharist to the dogs, with every circumstance of ignominy which could provoke and perpetuate the animosity of religious factions. 9. Notwithstanding this irreconcilable aversion, the two parties, who were mixed and separated in all the cities of Africa, had the same language and manners, the same zeal and learning, the same faith and worship. Proscribed by the civil and ecclesiastical powers of the empire, the Donatists still maintained in some provinces, particularly in Numidia, their superior numbers, and 400 bishops acknowledged the jurisdiction of their primate. But the invincible spirit of the sect sometimes preyed on its own vitals, and the bosom of their schismatical church was torn by intestine divisions. A fourth part of the Donatist bishops followed the independent standard of the Maximianists. The narrow and solitary path which their first leaders had marked out continued to deviate from the great society of mankind. Even the imperceptible sect of the Rogatians could affirm without a blush that when Christ should descend to judge the earth, he would find his true religion preserved only in a few nameless villages of the Caesarean Mauritania. 10. 8 Return. The councils of Arles, of Nice, and of Trent confirmed the wise and moderate practice of the Church of Rome. The Donatists, however, had the advantage of maintaining the sentiment of Cyprian and of a considerable part of the primitive church. Vincentius Lyrinensis p. 532, ap. e. 532, ap. e. 38 has explained why the Donatists are eternally burning with the Donatists are eternally burning with the devil, while Saint Cyprian reigns in heaven with Jesus Christ. 9 Return, see the 6th book of Optatus Milevitanus, p. 91 3030s Milevitanus, t. Min Return, Tillamont, Mimau, Ecclesiastiques Tom, 6 Part I, p. 253. He laughs at their partial credulity. He revered Augustine, the great doctor of the system of predestination. The schism of the Donatists was confined to Africa. the more diffusive mischief of the Trinitarian controversy successively penetrated into every part of the Christian world. The former was an accidental quarrel, occasioned by the abuse of freedom. The latter was a high and mysterious argument, derived from the abuse of philosophy. From the age of Constantine to that of Clovis and Theodoric, the temporal interests both of the Romans and barbarians were deeply involved in the theological disputes of Arianism. The historian may therefore be permitted respectfully to withdraw the veil of the sanctuary, and to deduce the progress of reason and faith, of error and passion from the school of Plato to the decline and fall of the empire. The genius of Plato, informed by his own meditation or by the traditional knowledge of the priests of Egypt, 11 had ventured to explore the mysterious nature of the deity. When he had elevated his mind to the sublime contemplation of the first self-existent, necessary cause of the universe, the Athenian sage was incapable of conceiving how the simple unity of his essence could admit the infinite variety of distinct and successive ideas which composed the model of the intellectual world. How a being purely incorporeal could execute that perfect model and mold with a plastic hand the rude and independent chaos. The vain hope of extricating himself from these difficulties, which must ever oppress the feeble powers of the human mind, might induce Plato to consider the divine nature under the threefold modification of the first cause, the reason or logos, and the soul or spirit of the universe. His poetical imagination sometimes fixed and animated these metaphysical abstractions. The three archetypal on original principles were represented in the Platonic system as three gods, united with each other by a mysterious and ineffable generation, and the logos was particularly considered under the more accessible character of the son of an eternal father and the creator and governor of the world. Such appear to have been the secret doctrines which were cautiously whispered in the gardens of the Academy, and which, according to the more recent disciples of Plato, 1111, could not be perfectly understood till after an assiduous study of 30 years. 1211 returntim bistruna. Plato. Egyptum paragravit ute sacerdotibus, barbaris numeros ecce lestia acciperet. Cicero de Finibus, v. 25. The Egyptians might still preserve the traditional creed of the patriarchs. Josephus has persuaded many of the Christian fathers that Plato derived a part of his knowledge from the Jews, but this vain opinion cannot be reconciled with the obscure state and unsocial manners of the Jewish people, whose scriptures were not accessible to Greek curiosity till more than 100 years after the death of Plato. See Marsham Canon, Cron P. 44, Leclerc Epistole, Critic, 7, p. 77 This exposition of the doctrine of Plato appears to me contrary to the true sense of that philosopher's writings. The brilliant imagination which he carried into metaphysical inquiries, his style full of allegories and figures, have misled those interpreters who did not seek, from the whole tenor of his works and beyond the images which the writer employs, the system of this philosopher. In my opinion, there is no trinity in Plato. He has established no mysterious generation between the three pretended principles which he is made to distinguish. Finally, he conceives only as attributes of the deity, or of matter, those ideas of which it is supposed that he made substances, real beings. According to Plato, God and matter existed from all eternity. Before the creation of the world, matter had in itself a principle of motion, but without end or laws. It is this principle which Plato calls the irrational soul of the world, because, according to his doctrine, every spontaneous and original principle of motion is called soul. God wished to impress form upon matter, that is to say, 1, to mold matter and make it into a body, 2, to regulate its motion and subject it to some end and to certain laws. The deity, in this operation, could not act but according to the ideas existing in his intelligence. Their union filled this and formed the ideal type of the world. It is this ideal world, this divine intelligence, existing with God from all eternity, and called by Plato, which he is supposed to personify, to substantialize, while an attentive examination is sufficient to convince us that he has never assigned it an existence external to the deity, hors de la divinité, and that he considered as the aggregate of the ideas of God, the divine understanding in its relation to the world. The contrary opinion is irreconcilable with all his philosophy. Thus he says, Timaeus, p. 348, edit. BP. That to the idea of the deity is essentially united that of intelligence, of a logos. He would thus have admitted a double logos, of nor or one inherent in the deity as an attribute, the other independently existing as a substance. He affirms that the intelligence, the principle of order, cannot exist but as an attribute of a soul, the principle of motion and of life, of which the nature is unknown to us. How then, according to this, could he consider the logos as a substance endowed with an independent existence? In other places, he explains it by these two words, knowledge, science, and intelligence, which signify the attributes of the deity. When Plato separates God, the ideal archetype of the world and matter, it is to explain how, according to his system, God has proceeded, at the creation, to unite the principle of order which he had within himself, his proper intelligence, the principle of motion, to the principle of motion, the irrational soul which was in matter. When he speaks of the place occupied by the ideal world, it is to designate the divine intelligence which is its cause. Finally, in no part of his writings do we find a true personification of the pretended beings of which he is said to have formed a trinity, and if this personification existed, it would equally apply to many other notions of which might be formed many different trinities. This error, into which many ancient as well as modern interpreters of Plato have fallen, was very natural. Besides the snares which were concealed in his figurative style, besides the necessity of comprehending as a whole the system of his ideas, and not to explain isolated passages, the nature of his doctrine itself would conduce to this error. When Plato appeared, the uncertainty of human knowledge and the continual illusions of the senses were acknowledged and had given rise to a general skepticism. Socrates had aimed at raising morality above the influence of this skepticism. Plato endeavored to save metaphysics by seeking in the human intellect a source of certainty which the senses could not furnish. He invented the system of innate ideas, of which the aggregate formed, according to him, the ideal world, and affirmed that these ideas were real attributes, not only attached to our conceptions of objects, but to the nature of the objects themselves, a nature of which from them we might obtain a knowledge. He gave then to these ideas a positive existence as attributes. His commentators could easily give them a real existence as substances, especially as the terms which he used to designate them, essential beauty, essential goodness, lent themselves to this substantialization, hypostasis. We have retained this view of the original philosophy of Plato, in which there is probably much truth. The genius of Plato was rather metaphysical than impersonative. His poetry was in his language, rather than, like that of the Orientals, in his conceptions. 12 Return. The modern guides who lead me to the knowledge of the Platonic system are Cudworth, Basnage, Leclerc, and Brooker. As the learning of these writers was equal, and their intention different, an inquisitive observer may derive instruction from their disputes, and certainty from their agreement. The arms of the Macedonians diffused over Asia and Egypt, the language and learning of Greece, and the theological system of Plato was taught, with less reserve, and perhaps with some improvements, in the celebrated school of Alexandria. 13. A numerous colony of Jews had been invited, by the favor of the Ptolemies, to settle in their new capital. 14. While the bulk of the nation practiced the legal ceremonies and pursued the lucrative occupations of commerce, a few Hebrews, of a more liberal spirit, devoted their lives to religious and philosophical contemplation. 15. They cultivated with diligence and embraced with ardor the theological system of the Athenian sage. But their national pride would have been mortified by a fair confession of their former poverty, and they boldly marked, as the sacred inheritance of their ancestors, the gold and jewels which they had so lately stolen from their Egyptian masters. 100 years before the birth of Christ, a philosophical treatise which manifestly betrays the style and sentiments of the school of Plato was produced by the Alexandrian Jews and unanimously received as a genuine and valuable relic of the inspired wisdom of Solomon. 16. A similar union of the Mosaic faith and the Grecian philosophy distinguishes the works of Philo, which were composed for the most part under the reign of Augustus. 17. The material soul of the universe. 18. Might offend the piety of the Hebrews, but they applied the character of the Logos to the Jehovah of Moses and the patriarchs, and the Son of God was introduced upon earth under a visible and even human appearance to perform those familiar offices which seem incompatible with the nature and attributes of the universal cause. 1913. Return the Brucker, Hist, Philosoph, Tom, P. 1349, 1914-49, 1950-49, 1950-57. The Alexandrian school is celebrated by Strabo il XVI and Ammianus XXI. 6. Note: the philosophy of Plato was not the only source of that professed in the school of Alexandria. That city, in which Greek, Jewish, and Egyptian men of letters were assembled, was the scene of a strange fusion of the system of these three people. The Greeks brought a Platonism already much changed, the Jews, who had acquired at Babylon a great number of Oriental notions, and whose theological opinions had undergone great changes by this intercourse, endeavored to reconcile Platonism with their new doctrine, and disfigured it entirely. Lastly, the Egyptians, who were not willing to abandon notions for which the Greeks themselves entertained respect, endeavored on their side to reconcile their own with those of their neighbors. It is in Ecclesiasticus and the Wisdom of Solomon that we trace the influence of Oriental philosophy rather than that of Platonism. We find in these books, and in those of the later prophets, as in Ezekiel, notions unknown to the Jews before the Babylonian captivity, of which we do not discover the germ in Plato, but which are manifestly derived from the Orientals. Thus God represented under the image of light and the principle of evil under that of darkness, the history of the good and bad angels, paradise and hell, and sea, are doctrines of which the origin, or at least the positive determination, can only be referred to the Oriental philosophy. Plato supposed matter eternal. The Orientals and the Jews considered it as a creation of God, who alone was eternal. It is impossible to explain the philosophy of the Alexandrian school solely by the blending of the Jewish theology with the Greek philosophy. The Oriental philosophy, however little it may be known, is recognized at every instant. Thus, according to the Zend-Avesta, it is by the word Onover more ancient than the world that Ormuzd created the universe. This word is the logos of Philo, consequently very different from that of Plato. I have shown that Plato never personified the logos as the ideal archetype of the world. Philo ventured this personification. The deity, according to him, has a double logos. The first is the ideal archetype of the world, the ideal world, the firstborn of the deity. The second is the word itself of God, personified under the image of a being acting to create the sensible world, and to make it like to the ideal world. It is the second-born of God. Following out his imaginations, Philo went so far as to personify anew the ideal world under the image of a celestial man, the primitive type of man, and the sensible world under the image of another man less perfect than the celestial man. Certain notions of the Oriental philosophy may have given rise to this strange abuse of allegory, which it is sufficient to relate to show what alterations Platonism had already undergone and what was their source. Philo, moreover, of all the Jews of Alexandria, is the one whose Platonism is the most pure. It is from this mixture of Orientalism, Platonism, and Judaism that Gnosticism arose, which had produced so many theological and philosophical extravagancies, and in which Oriental notions evidently predominate. G. 14, return, Joseph. Antiquitat, L12, Cine 4, 3, Basnage, Hist, des Juifs L. Praetes, L7, Phi 10 return, for the origin of the Jewish philosophy, see Eusebius, Praeparat, Evangel, VI, 9, 10. According to Philo, the Therapeutai studied philosophy, and Brucker has proved, Hist. Philosoph. 2. p. 787, that they gave the preference to that of Plato. 16. Return C. Calmet, Dissertations sur la Bible. 2. C. Calmet, Dissertations sur la Bible. 2. p. 277. The Book of the Wisdom of Solomon was received by many of the Fathers as the work of that monarch, and although rejected by the Protestants for want of a Hebrew original, it has obtained, with the rest of the Vulgate, the sanction of the Council of Trent. Trenzian Cerny Turn. The Platonism of Philo, which was famous to a proverb, is proved beyond a doubt by Leclerc, Epist. Crit. Vi. p. 211, 22.8. Basnage est. Des Juifs. Liv. c. 5 has clearly ascertained that the theological works of Philo were composed before the death, and most probably before the birth, of Christ. In such a time of darkness, the knowledge of Philo is more astonishing than his errors. Bull defends Donreton, EESICI, p. 12.18, return molum et magno se corpore misset. Besides this material soul, Cudworth has discovered P.E.56.2 in Aemilius Porphyry Plotinus and, as he thinks in Plato himself, a superior spiritual upocosmian soul of the universe. But this double soul is exploded by Brucker, Basnage, and Leclerc as an idle fancy of the latter Platonists. 19 Return. Petov. Dogmata Theologica, Tom. 2, L8, CS T, Fic Toint. Nissen SICL P813. This notion, till it was abused by the Arians, was freely adopted in the Christian theology. Tertullian Adva Praxium C16 has a remarkable and dangerous passage. After contrasting with indiscreet wit the nature of God and the actions of Jehovah, he concludes, Silicet ut haec de filio Dei non credenda fuisse, si non scripta assent, forta si non credenda de latra licet scripta. Note, Tertullian is here arguing against the Patripassians, those who asserted that the Father was born of the Virgin, died and was buried. Chapter 21, Persecution of Heresy, State of the Church. Part 2. The eloquence of Plato, the name of Solomon, the authority of the School of Alexandria, and the consent of the Jews and Greeks were insufficient to establish the truth of a mysterious doctrine which might please, but could not satisfy, a rational mind. A prophet or apostle, inspired by the deity, can alone exercise a lawful dominion over the faith of mankind, and the theology of Plato might have been forever confounded with the philosophical visions of the Academy, the Porch, and the Lyceum, if the name and divine attributes of the Logos had not been confirmed by the celestial pen of the last and most sublime of the evangelists. 20. The Christian revelation, which was consummated under the reign of Nerva, disclosed to the world the amazing secret that the Logos, who was with God from the beginning, and was God, who had made all things, and for whom all things had been made, was incarnate in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, who had been born of a virgin, and suffered death on the cross. Besides the general design of fixing on a perpetual basis the divine honors of Christ, the most ancient and respectable of the ecclesiastical writers have ascribed to the evangelic theologian a particular intention to confute two opposite heresies which disturbed the peace of the primitive church. 21i. The faith of the Ebionites, 22 perhaps of the Nazarenes, 23, was gross and imperfect. They revered Jesus as the greatest of the prophets, endowed with supernatural virtue and power. They ascribed to his person and to his future reign all the predictions of the Hebrew oracles which relate to the spiritual and everlasting kingdom of the promised Messiah. 24. Some of them might confess that he was born of a virgin, but they obstinately rejected the preceding existence and divine perfections of the Logos, or Son of God, which are so clearly defined in the Gospel of St. John. About 50 years afterwards, the Ebionites, whose errors are mentioned by Justin Martyr with less severity than they seem to deserve, 25 formed a very inconsiderable portion of the Christian name. I2, the Gnostics, who were distinguished by the epithet of Docetes, deviated into the contrary extreme and betrayed the human while they asserted the divine nature of Christ. Educated in the school of Plato, accustomed to the sublime idea of the Logos, they readily conceived that the brightest aeon, or emanation of the deity, might assume the outward shape and visible appearances of a mortal. 26. But they vainly pretended that the imperfections of matter are incompatible with the purity of a celestial substance. While the blood of Christ yet smoked on Mount Calvary, the Docetes invented the impious and extravagant hypothesis that, instead of issuing from the womb of the Virgin, 27, he had descended on the banks of the Jordan in the form of perfect manhood, that he had imposed on the senses of his enemies and of his disciples, and that the ministers of Pilate had wasted their impotent rage on an Uri phantom who seemed to expire on the cross and, after 3 days, to rise from the dead. 28:20, 20 turn. The Platonists admired the beginning of the Gospel of St. John as containing an exact transcript of their own principles. Augustine de Civitate Dei, X29, Aemilius Apud Cyril, Adverse, Julian, L. 8p 28:3. But in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Platonists of Alexandria might improve their Trinity by the secret study of the Christian theology. Note: a short discussion on the sense in which St. John has used the word logos will prove that he has not borrowed it from the philosophy of Plato. The evangelist adopts this word without previous explanation as a term with which his contemporaries were already familiar and which they could at once comprehend. To know the sense which he gave to it, we must inquire that which it generally bore in his time. We find two, the one attached to the word logos by the Jews of Palestine, the other by the school of Alexandria, particularly by Philo. The Jews had feared at all times to pronounce the name of Jehovah. They had formed a habit of designating God by one of his attributes. They called him sometimes wisdom, sometimes the Word. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made. Psalm XXXXEI. 6. Accustomed to allegories, they often addressed themselves to this attribute of the deity as a real being. Solomon makes wisdom say, "The Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever the earth was." James D8. Chenkiri. Mus Hmpus, from the beginning, or ever the earth was. Ch. 22, 2-3. Their residence in Persia only increased this inclination to sustained allegories. In the Ecclesiasticus of the son of Sirach and the Book of Wisdom, we find allegorical descriptions of wisdom like the following. I came out of the mouth of the Most High, I covered the earth as a cloud, I alone compassed the circuit of heaven, and walked in the bottom of the deep. The Creator created me from the beginning, before the world, and I shall never fail. Eccles, XXF, 35-39. See also the Wisdom of Solomon, CXXXXXX. The latter book is clearly Alexandrian. Me. We see from this that the Jews understood from the Hebrew and Chaldaic words which signify wisdom, the word, and which were translated into Greek, a simple attribute of the deity, allegorically personified, but of which they did not make a real particular being separate from the deity. The school of Alexandria, on the contrary, and Philo among the rest, mingling Greek with Jewish and Oriental notions and abandoning himself to his inclination to mysticism, personified the Logos and represented it a distinct being, created by God and intermediate between God and man. This is the second Logos of Philo, that which acts from the beginning of the world, alone in its kind, creator of the sensible world, formed by God according to the ideal world which he had in himself, and which was the first Logos, the firstborn of the deity. The Logos taken in this sense, then, was a created being, but anterior to the creation of the world, near to God, and charged with his revelations to mankind. Which of these two senses is that which St. John intended to assign to the word logos in the first chapter of his Gospel and in all his writings? John was a Jew, born and educated in Palestine. He had no knowledge, at least very little, of the philosophy of the Greeks and that of the Grecian Jews. He would naturally, then, attach to the word logos the sense attached to it by the Jews of Palestine. If, in fact, we compare the attributes which he assigns to the Logos with those which are assigned to it in Proverbs, in the Wisdom of Solomon, in Ecclesiasticus, we shall see that they are the same. The Word was in the world, and the world was made by him. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. ASCT. IVC 10-14. It is impossible not to trace in this chapter the ideas which the Jews had formed of the allegorized Logos. The evangelist afterwards really personifies that which his predecessors have personified only poetically, for he affirms that the Word became flesh, v. 14. It was to prove this that he wrote, "Closely examined, the ideas which he gives of the Logos cannot agree with those of Philo and the school of Alexandria. They correspond, on the contrary, with those of the Jews of Palestine." Perhaps St. John, employing a well-known term to explain a doctrine which was yet unknown, has slightly altered the sense. It is this alteration which we appear to discover on comparing different passages of his writings. It is worthy of remark that the Jews of Palestine, who did not perceive this alteration, could find nothing extraordinary in what St. John said of the Logos. At least they comprehended it without difficulty, while the Greeks and Greek-speaking Jews, on their part, brought to it prejudices and preconceptions easily reconciled with those of the evangelist, who did not expressly contradict them. This circumstance must have much favored the progress of Christianity. Thus, the fathers of the Church in the 2 first centuries and later, formed almost all in the school of Alexandria, gave to the Logos of St. John a sense nearly similar to that which it received from Philo. Their doctrine approached very near to that which in the 4th century the Council of Nicaea condemned in the person of Arius. G.M. Guizot has forgotten the long residence of St. John at Ephesus, the center of the mingling opinions of the East and West, which were gradually growing up into Gnosticism. See Matter, Hist. du Gnosticisme, Vol. EP. 54. John's sense of the Logos seems as far removed from the simple allegory ascribed to the Palestinian Jews as from the Oriental impersonation of the Alexandrian. The simple truth may be that St. John took the familiar term and, as it were, infused into it the peculiar and Christian sense in which it is used in his writings. M21 returned to Cibosobre, Hist. Critique du Manichaeisme, Tom. IP 377. The Gospel, according to St. John, is supposed to have been published about 70 years after the death of Christ. 22. Return. The sentiments of the Ebionites are fairly stated by Moshim, p. 331, and Leclerc, Hist. Eccles, p. 535. The Clementines, published among the Apostolical Fathers, are attributed by the critics to one of these sectaries. 23. Return. Staunch polemics like a bull, Judicium Eccles, Cathal, c. 2 insist on the orthodoxy of the Nazarenes, which appears less pure and certain in the eyes of Mosheim, p. 30-24. Return. The humble condition and sufferings of Jesus have always been a stumbling block to the Jews. Deus contrarius coloribus messium depinxerat, futuris erat rex judex pastor, and c. Limborch et Orobio amica colat, p. 8-19, 53-76, 22-23-34. But this objection has obliged the believing Christians to lift up their eyes to a spiritual and everlasting kingdom. 25. Return. Justin Martyr Dialogue. Cum Trifonte, p. 43-44. C. Leclerc, Hist. Eccles, p. 615. Bull and his editor Grabe Judicium Eccles. Cathal, c7, and Appendix attempt to distort either the sentiments or the words of Justin, but their violent correction of the text is rejected even by the Benedictine editors. With the 26th return, the Arians reproached the Orthodox party with borrowing their Trinity from the Valentinians and Marcionites. See Bozabre, Hist. De Manichaeisme, L3c. 5-7. 27. Return. Non dignum est ex utero credere Deum, et Deum Christum, non dignum est ut tanta majestas persodes et squalore, muli eris transia credatur. The Gnostics asserted the impurity of matter and of marriage, and they were scandalized by the gross interpretations of the Fathers and even of Augustine himself. See Bosabre, Tom. IIP 523. And note, the greater part of the Docetae rejected the true divinity of Jesus Christ, as well as his human nature. They belonged to the Gnostics, whom some philosophers, in whose party Gibbon has enlisted, make to derive their opinions from those of Plato. These philosophers did not consider that Platonism had undergone continual alterations, and that those who gave it some analogy with the notions of the Gnostics were later in their origin than most of the sects comprehended under this name. Mosheim has proved in his Instit. Hista. Eccles, Major. SIP 136, SQK and p. 3039 SQQ, that the Oriental philosophy, combined with the Kabbalistical philosophy of the Jews, had given birth to Gnosticism. The relations which exist between this doctrine and the records which remain to us of that of the Orientals, the Chaldean and Persian, have been the source of the errors of the Gnostic Christians who wish to reconcile their ancient notions with their new belief. It is on this account that, denying the human nature of Christ, they also denied his intimate union with God, and took him for one of the substances, aeons, created by God. As they believed in the eternity of matter, and considered it to be the principle of evil, in opposition to the deity, the first cause and principle of good, they were unwilling to admit that one of the pure substances, one of the aeons which came forth from God, had, by partaking in the material nature, allied himself to the principle of evil, and this was their motive for rejecting the real humanity of Jesus Christ. See Ch.21 Walch, Hist of Heresies in Germ. TIP 217, SQ2, Brucker, Hist, Crit, Phil, 2, p. 639, G. 28 Return. Apostolus adhuc in seculo superstitibus, apud Judaeam Christi sanguine recente, et phantasma corpus Domini acerebatur. Cortelarius thinks, Patris Apostle, Tom, II, p. 24, that those who will not allow the Docetes to have arisen in the time of the apostles may with equal reason deny that the sun shines at noonday. These Docetes, who formed the most considerable party among the Gnostics, were so called because they granted only a seeming body to Christ. Note, the name of Docetiae was given to these sectaries only in the course of the 2nd century. This name did not designate a sect, properly so called. It applied to all the sects who taught the non-reality of the material body of Christ. Of this number were the Valentinians, the Basilidians, the Ophites, the Ophites, the Marcionites, against whom Tertullian wrote his book, Decani Christi, and other Gnostics. In truth, Clement of Alexandria, LII, Strom, c. 13p. 552, makes express mention of a sect of Docetae, and even names as one of its heads a certain Cassianus, but everything leads us to believe that it was not a distinct sect. Philastrius de Heres, c. 31, reproaches Saturninus with being a Docetae. Irenaeus Advi, c. 23, makes the same reproach against Basilides. Epiphanius and Philastrius, who have treated in detail on each particular heresy, do not specially name that of the Docetae. Serapion, Bishop of Antioch, Euseb, Hist, Eccles, LV, c. 12, and Clement of Alexandria, ELVE, Strom, p. 92, appear to be the first to have used the generic name. It is not found in any earlier record, though the error which it points out existed even in the time of the apostles. See Ch.G.F. Walch, Hist, of Her, VI, p. 283, Tillemont, Mempor Severe, alla Hist equals, 2, p. 50, Budaeus de equals, Apost, c. 5 and 7g. The divine sanction, which the apostle had bestowed on the fundamental principle of the theology of Plato, encouraged the learned proselytes of the 2nd and 3rd centuries to admire and study the writings of the Athenian sage, who had thus marvelously anticipated one of the most surprising discoveries of the Christian revelation. The respectable name of Plato was used by the Orthodox, 29, and abused by the heretics, 30, as the common support of truth and error, the authority of his skillful commentators, and the science of dialectics were employed to justify the remote consequences of his opinions and to supply the discreet silence of the inspired writers. The same subtle and profound questions concerning the nature, the generation, the distinction, and the equality of the 3 divine persons of the mysterious triad, or Trinity 31, were agitated in the philosophical and in the Christian schools of Alexandria. An eager spirit of curiosity urged them to explore the secrets of the abyss, and a pride of the professors and of their disciples was satisfied with the sciences of words. But the most sagacious of the Christian theologians, the great Athanasius himself, has candidly confessed, 32, that whenever he forced his understanding to meditate on the divinity of the Logos, his toilsome and unavailing efforts recoiled on themselves, that the more he thought, the less he comprehended, and the more he wrote, the less capable was he of expressing his thoughts. In every step of the inquiry, we are compelled to feel and acknowledge the immeasurable disproportion between the size of the object and the capacity of the human mind. We may strive to abstract the notions of time, of space, and of matter, which so closely adhere to all the perceptions of our experimental knowledge. But as soon as we presume to reason of infinite substance, of spiritual generation, as often as we deduce any positive conclusions from a negative idea, we are involved in darkness, perplexity, and inevitable contradiction. As these difficulties arise from the nature of the subject, they oppress with the same insuperable weight the philosophic and the theological disputant. But we may observe two essential and peculiar circumstances which discriminated the doctrines of the Catholic Church from the opinions of the Platonic school. Ch.21 return. Some proofs of the respect which the Christians entertained for the person and doctrine of Plato may be found in De la Morthalavia, Tom, Vir p. 135-1 and c. edit. 1757, and Basnage, Hist. des Juifs, Tom, 4 p. 29, 79, and c. 30 return Delio bona fide, Platonum omnium hereticorum condamentarium factum, Tertullian, De Anima, c. 23, Petavius Dogma, Theologue, Tom, 3, Proleg. 2 shows that this was a general complaint. Bosobre, Ch.21, IL 3, c. 9, 10, has deduced the Gnostic errors from Platonic principles, and as, in the school of Alexandria, those principles were blended with the Oriental philosophy, Brooker, Tom, IRP, 1356, the sentiment of Bosobre may be reconciled with the opinion of Moschheim, General History of the Church, Volume EP 37, the 31 return. If Theophilus, Bishop of Antioch, C. Dupin, Bibliothèque Ecclésiastique, Tom, IP 66, was the first who employed the word triad, trinity, that abstract term, which was already familiar to the schools of philosophy, must have been introduced into the theology of the Christians after the middle of the 2nd century. The 32 return. Athanasius, Tom, IP 88. His expressions have an uncommon energy, and as he was writing to monks, there could not be any occasion for him to affect a rational language. A chosen society of philosophers, men of a liberal education and curious disposition, might silently meditate and temperately discuss in the gardens of Athens or the library of Alexandria the abstruse questions of metaphysical science. The lofty speculations which neither convinced the understanding nor agitated the passions of the Platonists themselves were carelessly overlooked by the idle, the busy, and even the studious part of mankind. 33. But after the Logos had been revealed as the sacred object of the faith, the hope, and the religious worship of the Christians, the mysterious system was embraced by a numerous and increasing multitude in every province of the Roman world. Those persons who, from their age or sex or occupations, were the least qualified to judge, who were the least exercised in the habits of abstract reasoning, aspired to contemplate the economy of the divine nature, and it is the boast of Tertullian, 34, that a Christian mechanic could readily answer such questions as had perplexed the wisest of the Grecian sages. Where the subject lies so far beyond our reach, the difference between the highest and the lowest of human understandings may indeed be calculated as infinitely small, yet the degree of weakness may perhaps be measured by the degree of obstinacy and dogmatic confidence. These speculations, instead of being treated as the amusement of a vacant hour, became the most serious business of the present and the most useful preparation for a future life. A theology which it was incumbent to believe, which it was impious to doubt, and which it might be dangerous and even fatal to mistake, became the familiar topic of private meditation and popular discourse. The cold indifference of philosophy was inflamed by the fervent spirit of devotion, and even the metaphors of common language suggested the fallacious prejudices of sense and experience. The Christians, who abhorred the gross and impure generation of the Greek mythology, 35 were tempted to argue from the familiar analogy of the filial and paternal relations. The character of Sunol seemed to imply a perpetual subordination to the voluntary author of his existence, 36, but as the act of generation, in the most spiritual and abstracted sense, must be supposed to transmit the properties of a common nature. 37, they durst not presume to circumscribe the powers or the duration of the Son of an eternal and omnipotent Father. 80 years after the death of Christ, the Christians of Bithynia declared before the tribunal of Pliny that they invoked him as a god, and his divine honors have been perpetuated in every age and country by the various sects who assume the name of his disciples. 38. Their tender reverence for the memory of Christ and their horror for the profane worship of any created being would have engaged them to assert the equal and absolute divinity of the Logos if their rapid ascent towards the throne of heaven had not been imperceptibly checked by the apprehension of violating the unity and sole supremacy of the great Father of Christ and of the universe. The suspense and fluctuation produced in the minds of the Christians by these opposite tendencies may be observed in the writings of the theologians who flourished after the end of the apostolic age and before the origin of the Arian controversy. Their suffrage is claimed with equal confidence by the orthodox and by the heretical parties, and the most inquisitive critics have fairly allowed that if they had the good fortune of possessing the Catholic verity, they have delivered their conceptions in loose, inaccurate, and sometimes contradictory language. 39-33 return, in a treatise which professed to explain the opinions of the ancient philosophers concerning the nature of the gods, we might expect to discover the theological trinity of Plato. But Cicero very honestly confessed that although he had translated the Timaeus, he could never understand that mysterious dialogue. See Hieronym, Prefa, ad L. 12, in Isaiam, Tom, VP 54, Tertullian, in Apologue, C. 46, C. Bale, Dictionnaire, Almot Simonide, Almot Simonide. His remarks on the presumption of Tertullian are profound and interesting. Tritified return a Tertullian are profound and interesting. Yet the Proboli, or prolatio, which the most orthodox divines borrowed without scruple from the Valentinians and illustrated by the comparisons of a fountain and stream, the sun and its rays, and sea, either meant nothing or favored a material idea of the divine generation. See Bozabre, Tom, IL 3C7, P 548, the 36th return. Many of the primitive writers have frankly confessed that the Son owed his being to the will of the Father. See Clarke's Scripture, Trinity, p. 280-287. On the other hand, Athanasius and his followers seem unwilling to grant what they are afraid to deny. The schoolmen extricate themselves from this difficulty by the distinction of a preceding and a concomitant will. Petav, Dogm, Theologe, Tom, 2 L6, C8, P 587, 603, 38 return, Carmenque Christo quasi Deo discere, secum invisem, Plin, Epist, X 97. The sense of Deus, Elohim, in the ancient languages is critically examined by Leclerc, Ars Critica, p. 550-56, and the propriety of worshipping a very excellent creature is ably defended by the Socinian Emlen, Tracts, p. 29, 36, 51-1 return, C. Dale de Usu Patrum, and Leclerc, Bibliothèque Universelle, Tom, XP 49. To arraign the faith of the ante-Nicene Fathers was the object, or at least has been the effect, of the stupendous work of Petavius on the Trinity, Dogma, Theologue, Tom. Nor has the deep impression been erased by the learned defense of Bishop Bull. Note, Dr. Crostering-Secking. Burton's work on the doctrine of the ante-Nicene Fathers must be consulted by those who wish to obtain clear notions on this subject. Chapter 21. Persecution of Heresy, State of the Church. Part 3. I2. The devotion of individuals was the first circumstance which distinguished the Christians from the Platonists. The second was the authority of the Church. The disciples of philosophy asserted the rights of intellectual freedom, and their respect for the sentiments of their teachers was a liberal and voluntary tribute which they offered to superior reason. But the Christians formed a numerous and disciplined society, and the jurisdiction of their laws and magistrates was strictly exercised over the minds of the faithful. The loose wanderings of the imagination were gradually confined by creeds and confessions. 40. The freedom of private judgment submitted to the public wisdom of synods. The authority of a theologian was determined by his ecclesiastical rank, and the episcopal successors of the apostles inflicted the censures of the Church on those who deviated from the orthodox belief. But in an age of religious controversy, every act of oppression adds new force to the elastic vigor of the mind, and the zeal or obstinacy of a spiritual rebel was sometimes stimulated by secret motives of ambition or avarice. A metaphysical argument became the cause or pretense of political contests. The subtleties of the Platonic school were used as the badges of popular factions, and the distance which separated their respective tenets were enlarged or magnified by the acrimony of dispute. As long as the dark heresies of Praxeas and Sibelius labored to confound the Arthur with the Usonry, Esorn, 41, the orthodox party might be excused if they adhered more strictly and more earnestly to the distinction than to the equality of the divine persons. But as soon as the heat of controversy had subsided and the progress of the Sabellians was no longer an object of terror to the churches of Rome, of Africa, or of Egypt, the tide of theological opinion began to flow with a gentle but steady motion towards the contrary extreme, and the most orthodox doctors allowed themselves the use of the terms and definitions which had been censured in the mouth of the sectaries. 42. After the Edict of Toleration had restored peace and leisure to the Christians, the Trinitarian controversy was revived in the ancient seat of Platonism, the learned, the opulent, the tumultuous city of Alexandria, and the flame of religious discord was rapidly communicated from the schools to the clergy, the people, the province, and the East. The abstruse question of the eternity of the Logos was agitated in ecclesiastic conferences and popular sermons, and the heterodox opinions of Arius 43 were soon made public by his own zeal and by that of his adversaries. His most implacable adversaries have acknowledged the learning and blameless life of that eminent presbyter, who, in a former election, had declared, and perhaps generously declined, his pretensions to the episcopal throne. 44. His competitor Alexander assumed the office of his judge. The important cause was argued before him, and if at first he seemed to hesitate, he at length pronounced his final sentence as an absolute rule of faith. 45. The undaunted presbyter, who presumed to resist the authority of his angry bishop, was separated from the community of the church. But the pride of Arius was supported by the applause of a numerous party. He reckoned among his immediate followers 2 bishops of Egypt, 7 presbyters, 12 deacons, and what may appear almost incredible, 700 virgins. A large majority of the bishops of Asia appeared to support or favor his cause, and their measures were conducted by Eusebius of Caesarea, the most learned of the Christian prelates, and by Eusebius of Nicomedia, who had acquired the reputation of a statesman without forfeiting that of a saint. Synods in Palestine and Bithynia were opposed to the synods of Egypt. The attention of the prince and people was attracted by this theological dispute, and the decision at the end of 6 years, 46, was referred to the supreme authority of the General Council of Nice. 40. Return. The most ancient creeds were drawn up with the greatest latitude. See Bull, Judicium Eccles, Cathal, who tries to prevent Episcopius from deriving any advantage from this observation. 41. Return. The heresies of Praxeas, Sibelius, and C. are accurately explained by Moschim pp. 4205, 600, and 114. Praxeas, who came to Rome about the end of the 2nd century, deceived for some time the simplicity of the bishop, and was confuted by the pen of the angry Tertullian. To return, Socrates acknowledges that the heresy of Arius proceeded from his strong desire to embrace an opinion the most diametrically opposite to that of Sibelius, 233, Tremention. The figure and manners of Arius, the character and numbers of his first proselytes, are painted in very lively colors by Epiphanius, Tubal Pine, I. Heres. 69, 3p. 729, and we cannot but regret that he should soon forget the historian to assume the task of controversy. 3. And Godefroy's ample commentary. Yet the credibility of Philostorgius is lessened in the eyes of the orthodox by his Arianism, and in those of rational critics by his passion, his prejudice, and his ignorance. The 45 return. The 45 return, the 45th, represents Alexander as indifferent and even ignorant in the beginning of the controversy, while Socrates, LSE 5th, ascribes the origin of the dispute to the vain curiosity of his theological speculations. Dr. Jortin remarks on Ecclesiastical History, Volume 2, pp. 17:8 has censured, with his usual freedom, the conduct of Alexander, 46 return. The flames of Arianism might burn for some time in secret, but there is reason to believe that they burst out with violence as early as the year 319. Tillemont, Mem. Eccles. Tom. 6p. 774780. When the mysteries of the Christian faith were dangerously exposed to public debate, it might be observed that the human understanding was capable of forming three distinct, though imperfect, systems concerning the nature of the divine Trinity, and it was pronounced that none of these systems, in a pure and absolute sense, were exempt from heresy and error. 47i. According to the first hypothesis, which was maintained by Arius and his disciples, the Logos was a dependent and spontaneous production, created from nothing by the will of the Father. The Son, by whom all things were made, 4:8 had been begotten before all worlds, and the longest of the astronomical periods could be compared only as a fleeting moment to the extent of his duration. Yet this duration was not infinite, 49, and there had been a time which preceded the ineffable generation of the Logos. On this only begotten Son, the Almighty Father had transfused his ample spirit and impressed the effulgence of his glory. Visible image of invisible perfection he saw, at an immeasurable distance beneath his feet, the thrones of the brightest archangels, yet he shone only with a reflected light, and, like the sons of the Roman emperors who were invested with the titles of Caesar or Augustus, 50, he governed the universe in obedience to the will of his father and monarch. 2. In the second hypothesis, the Logos possessed all the inherent incommunicable perfections which religion and philosophy appropriate to the supreme God. Three distinct and infinite minds or substances, three co-equal and co-eternal beings composed the divine essence. 51, and it would have implied contradiction that any of them should not have existed, or that they should ever cease to exist. 52. The advocates of a system which seemed to establish three independent deities attempted to preserve the unity of the first cause, so conspicuous in the design and order of the world, by the perpetual concord of their administration and the essential agreement of their will. A faint resemblance of this unity of action may be discovered in the societies of men and even of animals. The causes which disturb their harmony proceed only from the imperfection and inequality of their faculties, but the omnipotence which is guided by infinite wisdom and goodness cannot fail of choosing the same means for the accomplishment of the same ends. 3. Three beings who, by the self-derived necessity of their existence, possess all the divine attributes in the most perfect degree, who are eternal in duration, infinite in space, and intimately present to each other and to the whole universe, irresistibly force themselves on the astonished mind as one and the same being, 53, who, in the economy of grace, as well as in that of nature, may manifest himself under different forms and be considered under different aspects. By this hypothesis, a real substantial trinity is refined into a trinity of names and abstract modifications that subsist only in the mind which conceives them. The Logos is no longer a person, but an attribute, and it is only in a figurative sense that the epithet of Son can be applied to the eternal reason, which was with God from the beginning, and by which, not by whom, all things were made. The incarnation of the Logos is reduced to a mere inspiration of the divine wisdom which filled the soul and directed all the actions of the man Jesus. Thus, after revolving around the theological circle, we are surprised to find that the Sabellian ends where the Ebionite had begun, and that the incomprehensible mystery which excites our adoration eludes our inquiry. 5447. Return. Quid credidit? Certa, auta tria nomina audiens, triasse credidit, et idololotra effectus est, autata in tribus vocabulis, trinominem credens deum, in Sabellii heresim incurrit, autata edoctus ab Arianis, unum esse, verum deum patrum, filium et spiritum, sanctum credidit creaturas. Aut extra, he quid crederit nescio, Hieronym adve, Luciferianus. Jerome reserves for the last the orthodox system, which is more complicated and difficult. 2. 48. Return. As the doctrine of absolute creation from nothing was gradually introduced among the Christians, Beausobre 2, EIC, p. 65, 215, the dignity of the workman very naturally rose with that of the workman. Berinon return. The Metaphysics of Dr. Clarke Trinity, 276-280, could digest an eternal generation from an infinite cause. This profane and absurd simile is employed by several of the primitive fathers, particularly by Athenagoras in his apology to the Emperor Marcus and his son, and it is alleged without censure by Bull himself. C. defends. Fid. Nisan. Sect. Thid. Nisan. Sect. 3. C5. Number 451. Return. See Cudworth's Intellectual System. p. 5059, 5059. This dangerous hypothesis was countenanced by the two Gregories of Nyssa and Nazianzen, by Cyril of Alexandria, John of Damascus, and C. Cudworth, p. 63. Leclerc, Bibliothèque Universelle, tom. 118. p. 97, 2. Augustine seems to envy the freedom of the philosophers. Liberis verbis locuntur philosophi. Nos autem non dicamus duo vel tria principia, duos vel tre deos, de civitat. Dei Ch.23, 53. Return. Boetius, who was deeply versed in the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, explains the unity of the Trinity by the indifference of the three persons. See the judicious remarks of Leclerc, Bibliothèque Huisy, tom. 16, p. 2225, and C.21. If the Sabellians were startled at this conclusion, they were driven another precipice into the confession that the Father was born of a virgin, that he had suffered on the cross, and thus deserved the epithet of far praepatians, with which they were branded by their adversaries. See the invectives of Tertullian against Praxeas, and the temperate reflections of Mosheim, p. 423, 681, and Beausobre, tom. IL3C Tulla, 6p. 533. If the bishops of the Council of Nice 55 had been permitted to follow the unbiased dictates of their conscience, Arius and his associates could scarcely have flattered themselves with the hopes of obtaining a majority of votes in favor of an hypothesis so directly averse to the two most popular opinions of the Catholic world. The Arians soon perceived the danger of their situation and prudently assumed those modest virtues which, in the fury of civil and religious dissensions, are seldom practiced or even praised except by the weaker party. They recommended the exercise of Christian charity and moderation, urged the incomprehensible nature of the controversy, disclaimed the use of any terms or definitions which could not be found in the Scriptures, and offered, by very liberal concessions, to satisfy their adversaries without renouncing the integrity of their own principles. The victorious faction received all their proposals with haughty suspicion and anxiously sought for some irreconcilable mark of distinction, the rejection of which might involve the Arians in the guilt and consequences of heresy. A letter was publicly read and ignominiously torn, in which their patron, Eusebius of Nicomedia, ingenuously confessed that the admission of the homoousion, or consubstantial, a word already familiar to the Platonists, was incompatible with the principles of their theological system. The fortunate opportunity was eagerly embraced by the bishops, who governed the resolutions of the synod, and, according to the lively expression of Ambrose 56, they used the sword, which heresy itself had drawn from the scabbard, to cut off the head of the hated monster. The consubstantiality of the Father and the Son was established by the Council of Nicaea and has been unanimously received as a fundamental article of the Christian faith by the consent of the Greek, the Latin, the Oriental, and the Protestant churches. But if the same word had not served to stigmatize the heretics and to unite the Catholics, it would have been inadequate to the purpose of the majority by whom it was introduced into the Orthodox Creed. This majority was divided into two parties, distinguished by a contrary tendency to the sentiments of the Tritheists and of the Sabellians. But as those opposite extremes seemed to overthrow the foundations either of natural or revealed religion, they mutually agreed to qualify the rigor of their principles and to disavow the just but invidious consequences which might be urged by their antagonists. The interest of the common cause inclined them to join their numbers and to conceal their differences. Their animosity was softened by the healing counsels of toleration, and their disputes were suspended by the use of the mysterious homoousion, which either party was free to interpret according to their peculiar tenets. The Sabellian sense, which, about 50 years before, had obliged the Council of Antioch 57 to prohibit this celebrated term, had endeared it to those theologians who entertained a secret but partial affection for a nominal trinity. But the more fashionable saints of the Arian times, the intrepid Athanasius, the learned Gregory Nazianzen, and the other pillars of the Church who supported with ability and success the Nicene doctrine, appeared to consider the expression of substance as if it had been synonymous with that of nature, and they ventured to illustrate their meaning by affirming that three men, as they belong to the same common species, are consubstantial or homoousian to each other. 58. This pure and distinct equality was tempered on the one hand by the internal connection and spiritual penetration which indissolubly unites the divine persons. 59. And on the other by the preeminence of the Father, which was acknowledged as far as it is compatible with the independence of the Son. 60. Within these limits, the almost invisible and tremulous ball of orthodoxy was allowed securely to vibrate. On either side, beyond this consecrated ground, the heretics and the daemons lurked in ambush to surprise and devour the unhappy wanderer. But as the degrees of theological hatred depend on the spirit of the war, rather than on the importance of the controversy, the heretics who degraded were treated with more severity than those who annihilated the person of the Son. The life of Athanasius was consumed in irreconcilable opposition to the impious madness of the Arians, 61, but he defended above 20 years the Sabellianism of Marcellus of Ancyra, and when at last he was compelled to withdraw himself from his communion, he continued to mention with an ambiguous smile the venial errors of his respectable friend. 6255 Return. The transactions of the Council of Nicaea are related by the ancients, not only in a partial, but in a very imperfect manner. Such a picture as Fra Paolo would have drawn can never be recovered, but such rude sketches as have been traced by the pencil of bigotry and that of reason may be seen in Tillemont, Mem. Eccles, Tom. VP 6, 66-9, 759, and in Leclerc, Bibliothèque Universelle, Tom. XP 435-454, 56, Return. We are indebted to Ambrose de Fide, L3, knowledge of this curious anecdote. Hoc verbum quod videhunt adversaries esse formidini, ut ipsis gladio, ipsum nefandae caput Heresios, 57, Nifan, secti sect. 2tc. EP25, 30 sect. He thinks it his duty to reconcile two orthodox synods. 58 Return. According to Aristotle, the stars were homoousian to each other. That homoousios means of one substance in kind have been shown by Petavius, Curseleus, Cudworth, Leclerc, and C., and to prove it would be actum arga, AJ. This is the just remark of Dr. Jortin, Vol. EIP 2212, who examines the Arian controversy with learning, candor, and ingenuity. 59. Return. See Petavius, Dogmy. Theologue. Tom. 2. L4. C16, P. 453, and C. Cudworth, P53 and C. Cudworth, E5529, edit. Grab. The circumcessio is perhaps the deepest and darkest whole theological abyss. The 60 Return. The third section of Paul's defense of the Nicene faith, which some of his antagonists have called nonsense and others heresy, is consecrated to the supremacy of the Father. The 61 return, the ordinary appellation with which Athanasius and his followers chose to compliment the Arians, was that of Ariomanites, S62, return E. Epiphanius, Tom I. Harries, LXXI, 4p. 837, see The Adventures of Marcellus in Tillamont, Mem. Eccles, Tom, VIP, 880, 899. His work in one book of the Unity of God was answered in the E3 books, which are still extant, of Eusebius. After a long and careful examination, Petavius Tom, 2LIC14, Patane P78, has reluctantly pronounced the condemnation of Marcellus, the authority of a general council to which the Arians themselves had been compelled to submit, inscribed on the banners of the Orthodox party the mysterious characters of the word homoousion, which essentially contributed, notwithstanding some obscure disputes, some nocturnal combats, to maintain and perpetuate the uniformity of faith, or at least of language. The consubstantialists who, by their success, have deserved and obtained the title of Catholics, gloried in the simplicity and steadiness of their own creed, and insulted the repeated variations of their adversaries who were destitute of any certain rule of faith. The sincerity or the cunning of the Arian chiefs, the fear of the laws or of the people, their reverence for Christ, their hatred of Athanasius, all the causes, human and divine, that influence and disturb the councils of a theological faction, introduced among the sectaries a spirit of discord and inconstancy, which, in the course of a few years, erected 18 different models of religion, 63, and avenged the violated dignity of the Church. The zealous Hilary, 64, who, from the peculiar hardships of his situation, was inclined to extenuate rather than to aggravate the errors of the Oriental clergy, declares that in the wide extent of the 10 provinces of Asia, to which he had been banished, there could be found very few prelates who had preserved the knowledge of the true God. 65. The oppression which he had felt, the disorders of which he was the spectator and the victim, appeased, during a short interval, the angry passions of his soul, and in the following passage, of which I shall transcribe a few lines, the Bishop of Poitiers unwarily deviates into the style of a Christian philosopher. "It is a thing," says Hilary, "equally deplorable and dangerous, that there are as many creeds as opinions among men, as many doctrines as inclinations, and as many sources of blasphemy as there are faults among us, because we make creeds arbitrarily and explain them as arbitrarily." The homoousion is rejected and received and explained away by successive synods. The partial or total resemblance of the Father and of the Son is a subject of dispute for these unhappy times. Every year, nay, every moon, we make new creeds to describe invisible mysteries. We repent of what we have done, we defend those who repent, we anathematize those whom we defended. We condemn either the doctrine of others in ourselves or our own in that of others, and reciprocally tearing one another to pieces, we have been the cause of each other's ruin. 66-63. Return. Athanasius, in his epistle concerning the synods of Seleucia and Rimini, Tom, IP 886-905, has given an ample list of Arian creeds, which has been enlarged and improved by the labors of the indefatigable Tillamont, Milman. Eccles, Tom, 6p. 4077. 64. Return. Erasmus, with admirable sense and freedom, has delineated the just character of Hilary. To revise his text, to compose the annals of his life, and to justify his sentiments and conduct is the province of the Benedictine editors. 65. Return. Absque episcopo Eleucio et Porcis cum eo ex majore parte Asianae decem provinciae inte quas consisto vere deum nesciunt. Atque utinam penitus nesciunt, cum procliviore enim venia, ignoradant quam obtrecterunt. Hilar. De Synodes, Civ de Fide Orientalium, c. 63 p. 1186, edit. Benedict. In the celebrated parallel between atheism and superstition, the Bishop of Poitiers would have been surprised in the philosophic society of Bayle and Plutarch. 66. To return, Hilarius ad Constantium, LIC 4, 5p, 12-20. This remarkable passage deserved the attention of Mr. Locke, who has transcribed it, vol. Lau, 3p. 470, into the model of his new commonplace book. It will not be expected, it would not perhaps be endured, that I should swell this theological digression by a minute examination of the 18 creeds, the authors of which, for the most part, disclaimed the odious name of their parent Arius. It is amusing enough to delineate the form and to trace the vegetation of a singular plant, but the tedious detail of leaves without flowers and of branches without fruit would soon exhaust the patience and disappoint the curiosity of the laborious student. One question which gradually arose from the Arian controversy may, however, be noticed, as it served to produce and discriminate the three sects, who were united only by their common aversion to the homoousion of the Nicene Synod. 1. If they were asked whether the Son was like unto the Father, the question was resolutely answered in the negative by the heretics who adhered to the principles of Arius, or indeed to those of philosophy, which seemed to establish an infinite difference between the Creator and the most excellent of his creatures. This obvious consequence was maintained by Aetius, 67, on whom the zeal of his adversaries bestowed the surname of the atheist. His restless and aspiring spirit urged him to try almost every profession of human life. He was successively a slave, or at least a husbandman, a traveling tinker, a goldsmith, a physician, a schoolmaster, a theologian, and at last the apostle of a new church, which was propagated by the abilities of his disciple Eunomius. 68. Armed with texts of Scripture, and with captious syllogisms from the logic of Aristotle, the subtle Aetius had acquired the fame of an invincible disputant whom it was impossible either to silence or to convince. Such talents engaged the friendship of the Arian bishops, till they were forced to renounce and even to persecute a dangerous ally who, by the accuracy of his reasoning, had prejudiced their cause in the popular opinion and offended the piety of their most devoted followers. 2. The omnipotence of the Creator suggested a specious and respectful solution of the Father and the Son, and faith might humbly receive what reason could not presume to deny, that the supreme God might communicate his infinite perfections and create a being similar only to himself. 69. These Arians were powerfully supported by the weight and abilities of their leaders, who had succeeded to the management of the Eusebian interest and who occupied the principal thrones of the East. They detested perhaps with some affectation the impiety of Aetius. They professed to believe, either without reserve or according to the Scriptures, that the Son was different from all other creatures and similar only to the Father. But they denied that he was either of the same or of a similar substance, sometimes boldly justifying their dissent, and sometimes objecting to the use of the word substance, which seems to imply an adequate or at least a distinct notion of the nature of the deity. The sect which deserted the doctrine of a similar substance was the most numerous, at least in the provinces of Asia. And when the leaders of both parties were assembled in the Council of Seleucia, 70th, their opinion would have prevailed by a majority of 105 to 43 bishops. The Greek word, which was chosen to express this mysterious resemblance, bears so close an affinity to the orthodox symbol that the profane of every age have derided the furious contests which the difference of a single diphthong excited between the Homoousians and the Homoousians. As it frequently happens that the sounds and characters which approach the nearest to each other accidentally represent the most opposite ideas, the observation would be itself ridiculous if it were possible to mark any real and sensible distinction between the doctrine of the semi-Arians, as they were improperly styled, and that of the Catholics themselves. The Bishop of Poitiers, who in his Phrygian exile very wisely aimed at a coalition of parties, endeavors to prove that by a pious and faithful interpretation, 71, the homoousion may be reduced to a consubstantial sense. Yet he confesses that the word has a dark and suspicious aspect, and, as if darkness were congenial to theological disputes, the semi-Arians who advanced to the doors of the church assailed them with the most unrelenting fury. 67. Return. In Philostorgius L. Thurci c. In Philostorgius L. Thurci c. 50. The character and adventures of Aetius appear singular enough, though they are carefully softened by the hand of a friend. The editor, Godefroy, pp. 53, who was more attached to his principles than to his author, has collected the odious circumstances which his various adversaries have preserved or invented. Chapter Cent. Return. According to the judgment of a man who respected both these sectaries, Aetius had been endowed with a stronger understanding, and Eunomius had acquired more art and learning. Philostorgius L. 8 Cent. Number T. Gibbon 18. The Confession and Apology of Eunomius Fabricius, Bibliot. Grecat, Tom. 8, p. 258-305 is one of the few heretical pieces which have escaped Gibbon Cent. Return. Yet, according to the opinion of Estius and Bull, pp. 297, there is one power, that of creation, which God cannot communicate to a creature. Estius, who so accurately defined the limits of omnipotence, was a Dutchman by birth, and by trade a scholastic divine. Dupam Bibliot. Eccles, Tom. XVI, p. 45-70. Return. Sabinus Ap. Socrat. L. 2c. 39. Had copied the Acts. Athanasius and Hilary have explained the divisions of this Arian synod. The other circumstances, which are relative to it, are carefully collected by Barrow and Tillemont. 71. Return. Fideli et Pia. Intelligentia. De Synod. c. 77. p. 1193. In his short apologetical notes first published by the Benedictines from a MS. Of Chartres he observes that he used this cautious expression, qui intelligirum et impium, p. 2:1146. Philostorgius, who saw those objects through a different medium, is inclined to forget the difference of the important diphthong. See in particular vi. 17 and Godefroy, p. 352. The provinces of Egypt and Asia, which cultivated the language and manners of the Greeks, had deeply imbibed the venom of the Arian controversy. The familiar study of the Platonic system, a vain and argumentative disposition, a copious and flexible idiom, supplied the clergy and people of the East with an inexhaustible flow of words and distinctions, and, in the midst of their fierce contentions, they easily forgot the doubt which is recommended by philosophy, and the submission which is enjoined by religion. The inhabitants of the West were of a less inquisitive spirit. Their passions were not so forcibly moved by invisible objects, their minds were less frequently exercised by the habits of dispute, and such was the happy ignorance of the Gallican Church that Hilary himself, above 30 years after the First General Council, was still a stranger to the Nicene Creed. 72. The Latins had received the rays of divine knowledge through the dark and doubtful medium of a translation. The poverty and stubbornness of their native tongue was not always capable of affording just equivalents for the Greek terms, for the technical words of the Platonic philosophy. 73, which had been consecrated by the gospel or by the church to express the mysteries of the Christian faith, and a verbal defect might introduce into the Latin theology a long train of error or perplexity. 74. But as the Western provincials had the good fortune of deriving their religion from an orthodox source, they preserved with steadiness the doctrine which they had accepted with docility, and when the Arian pestilence approached their frontiers, they were supplied with the seasonable preservative of the homoousion by the paternal care of the Roman pontiff. Their sentiments and their temper were displayed in the memorable Synod of Rimini, which surpassed in numbers the Council of Nice, since it was composed of above 400 bishops of Italy, Africa, Spain, Gaul, Britain, and Illyricum. From the first debates it appeared that only 80 prelates adhered to the party, though they affected to anathematize the name and memory of Arius. But this inferiority was compensated by the advantages of skill, of experience, and of discipline. and the minority was conducted by Valens and Ursacius, two bishops of Illyricum who had spent their lives in the intrigues of courts and councils, and who had been trained under the Eusebian banner in the religious wars of the East. By their arguments and negotiations they embarrassed, they confounded, they at last deceived the honest simplicity of the Latin bishops, who suffered the palladium of the faith to be extorted from their hand by fraud and importunity rather than by open violence. The Council of Rimini was not allowed to separate till the members had imprudently subscribed a captious creed in which some expressions susceptible of an heretical sense were inserted in the room of the Homoousion. It was on this occasion that, according to Jerome, the world was surprised to find itself Arian. 75. But the bishops of the Latin provinces had no sooner reached their respective dioceses than they discovered their mistake and repented of their weakness. The ignominious capitulation was rejected with disdain and abhorrence, and the Homoousian standard, which had been shaken but not overthrown, was more firmly replanted in all the churches of the West. 76-72 Return. Testor Deum coeli aquae, terremi cum nutrum ordisem, semper tamen utrumque sensisi, regeneratus pridem et in episcopatu, aliquantisper manens fidem nicinum, nunquam nisi exulaturus ordivi, hila, de synodis, c. XCTF 205. The Benedictines are persuaded that he governed the diocese of Poitiers several years before his exile. 73 Return. Seneca Epist. 58 complains that even the Platonists, the eans of the bolder schoolmen, could not be expressed by a Latin noun. 74 Return. The preference which the Fourth Council of the Lateran at length gave to a numerical rather than a generical unity. See Petov, Tom. 2L. VC 14. 213p. 44 was favored by the Latin language, seems to excite the idea of substance, trinitas of qualities, ingemuit totus orbis, et Arianum, se esse miratus est, Hieronym, ad vi Lucifer. 45-76 Return. The story of the Council of Rimini is very elegantly told by Sulpicius Severus, Hist. Sacra, L2p. 419-430, edit. Logged, Bat. 6047, and by Jerome in his dialogue against the Luciferians. The design of the latter is to apologize for the conduct of the Latin bishops who were deceived and who repented. Chapter 21, Persecution of Heresy, State of the Church. Part 4. Such was the rise and progress, and such were the natural revolutions of those theological disputes which disturbed the peace of Christianity under the reigns of Constantine and of his sons. But as those princes presumed to extend their despotism over the faith, as well as over the lives and fortunes of their subjects, the weight of their suffrage sometimes inclined the ecclesiastical balance, and the prerogatives of the King of Heaven were settled, or changed, or modified in the cabinet of an earthly monarch. The unhappy spirit of discord which pervaded the provinces of the East interrupted the triumph of Constantine, but the emperor continued for some time to view, with cool and careless indifference, the object of the dispute. As he was yet ignorant of the difficulty of appeasing the quarrels of theologians, he addressed to the contending parties, to Alexander and to Arius, a moderating epistle, 77, which may be ascribed with far greater reason to the untutored sense of a soldier and statesman than to the dictates of any of his episcopal councillors. He attributes the origin of the whole controversy to a trifling and subtle question concerning an incomprehensible point of law, which was foolishly asked by the bishop and imprudently resolved by the presbyter. He laments that the Christian people, who had the same God, the same religion, and the same worship, should be divided by such inconsiderable distinctions, and he seriously recommends to the clergy of Alexandria the example of the Greek philosophers who could maintain their arguments without losing their temper and assert their freedom without violating their friendship. The indifference and contempt of the sovereign would have been, perhaps, the most effectual method of silencing the dispute, if the popular current had been less rapid and impetuous, and if Constantine himself, in the midst of faction and fanaticism, could have preserved the calm possession of his own mind. But his ecclesiastical ministers soon contrived to seduce the impartiality of the magistrate, and to awaken the zeal of the proselyte. He was provoked by the insults which had been offered to his statues. He was alarmed by the real as well as the imaginary magnitude of the spreading mischief, and he extinguished the hope of peace and toleration from the moment that he assembled 300 bishops within the walls of the same palace. The presence of the monarch swelled the importance of the debate, his attention multiplied the arguments, and he exposed his person with a patient intrepidity which animated the valor of the combatants. Notwithstanding the applause which has been bestowed on the eloquence and sagacity of Constantine, 78, a Roman general whose religion might be still a subject of doubt, and whose mind had not been enlightened either by study or by inspiration, was indifferently qualified to discuss in the Greek language a metaphysical question or an article of faith. But the credit of his favorite Osius, who appears to have presided in the Council of Nice, might dispose the emperor in favor of the orthodox party, and a well-timed insinuation that the same Eusebius of Nicomedia, who now protected the heretic, had lately assisted the tyrant, 79, might exasperate him against their adversaries. The Nicene Creed was ratified by Constantine, and his firm declaration that those who resisted the divine judgment of the synod must prepare themselves for an immediate exile annihilated the murmurs of a feeble opposition, which, from 17, was almost instantly reduced to 2 protesting bishops. Eusebius of Caesarea yielded a reluctant and ambiguous consent to the Homoousion, 80, and the wavering conduct of the Nicomedean Eusebius served only to delay, about 3 months, his disgrace and exile. 81. The impious Arius was banished into one of the remote provinces of Illyricum. His person and disciples were branded by law with the odious name of Porphyrians. His writings were condemned to the flames, and a capital punishment was denounced against those in whose possession they should be found. The emperor had now imbibed the spirit of controversy, and the angry, sarcastic style of his edicts was designed to inspire his subjects with the hatred which he had conceived against the enemies of Christ. 82-77. Return Eusebius invit. Constant. L2c. 64-72. The principles of toleration and religious indifference, contained in this epistle, have given great offense to Baronius, Tillemont, and C., who supposed that the emperor had some evil counselor, either Satan or Eusebius, at his elbow. See Corton's remarks, Tom. 2p. Arstian 3. Arstian Sendiu 3. Arstian Note. Heineken Excursus Extin 3. Quotes with approbation the term golden words applied by Ziegler to this moderate and tolerant letter of Constantine. May an English clergyman venture to express his regret that the fine gold soon became dim in the Christian Church? M78. Return Sendi Eusebius invit. Constantine. L3c. 313-79. Return Theodoret has preserved LIC. 20. An epistle from Constantine to the people of Nicomedia, in which the monarch declares himself the public accuser of one of his subjects. He styles Eusebius and complains of his hostile behavior during the civil war. An 80. Return. See in Socrates, LSE, 88, or rather in Theodoret, LSCE 12, an original letter of Eusebius of Caesarea, in which he attempts to justify his subscribing the Homoousion. The character of Eusebius has always been a problem, but those who have read the second critical epistle of Leclerc, Ars Critica, Tom, IIEEP 30-69, must entertain a very unfavorable opinion of the orthodoxy and sincerity of the Bishop of Caesarea. Dawn Return, Athanasius, Tom IP 727, Philostorgius, LIC 10, and Godefroy's Commentary, P41, 92 Return. Socrates, LIC 9. In his circular letters, which were addressed to the several cities, Constantine employed against the heretics the arms of ridicule and comic raillery. But, as if the conduct of the emperor had been guided by passion instead of principle, 3 years from the Council of Nice were scarcely elapsed before he discovered some symptoms of mercy and even of indulgence towards the proscribed sect, which was secretly protected by his favorite sister. The exiles were recalled, and Eusebius, who gradually resumed his influence over the mind of Constantine, was restored to the episcopal throne, from which he had been ignominiously degraded. Arius himself was treated by the whole court with the respect which would have been due to an innocent and oppressed man. His faith was approved by the Synod of Jerusalem, and the emperor seemed impatient to repair his injustice by issuing an absolute command that he should be solemnly admitted to the communion in the Cathedral of Constantinople. On the same day which had been fixed for the triumph of Arius, he expired, and the strange and horrid circumstances of his death might excite a suspicion that the Orthodox saints had contributed more efficaciously than by their prayers to deliver the Church from the most formidable of her enemies. 83. The three principal leaders of the Catholics, Athanasius of Alexandria, Eustathius of Antioch, and Paul of Constantinople, were deposed on various accusations by the sentence of numerous councils, and were afterwards banished into distant provinces by the first of the Christian emperors, who, in the last moments of his life, received the rites of baptism from the Arian bishop of Nicaea. The ecclesiastical government of Constantine cannot be justified from the reproach of levity and weakness, but the credulous monarch, unskilled in the stratagems of theological warfare, might be deceived by the modest and specious professions of the heretics, whose sentiments he never perfectly understood, and while he protected Arius and persecuted Athanasius, he still considered the Council of Nicaea as the bulwark of the Christian faith and the peculiar glory of his own reign. 84-83. Return. We derive the original story from Athanasius, Tom, IP 670, who expresses some reluctance to stigmatize the memory of the dead. He might exaggerate, but the perpetual commerce of Alexandria and Constantinople would have rendered it dangerous to invent. Those who press the literal narrative of the death of Arius, his bowels suddenly burst out in a privy, must make their option between poison and miracle. 84. Return. The change in the sentiments, or at least in the conduct of Constantine, may be traced in Eusebius, was tree, in vit, constant, eet, constant, eet. Ch.23, eet, Cleef, constant keys, elec 23, the lec 2329, Sozomen, ell2, c223-4, Theodoret LLLLLLT 2223-4, and Philostorgius L22, Key ET 117. But the first of these writers was too remote from it. It is singular enough that the important task of continuing the history of the Church should have been left for two laymen and a heretic. The sons of Constantine must have been admitted from their childhood into the rank of catechumens, but they imitated, in the delay of their baptism, the example of their father. Like him, they presumed to pronounce their judgment on mysteries into which they had never been regularly initiated. 85. And the fate of the Trinitarian controversy depended, in a great measure, on the sentiments of Constantius, who inherited the provinces of the East and acquired the possession of the whole empire. The Arian presbyter or bishop, who had secreted for his use the testament of the deceased emperor, improved the fortunate occasion which had introduced him to the familiarity of a prince whose public counsels were always swayed by his domestic favorites. The eunuchs and slaves diffused the spiritual poison through the palace, and the dangerous infection was communicated by the female attendants to the guards and by the empress to her unsuspicious husband. 86. The partiality which Constantius always expressed towards the Eusebian faction was insensibly fortified by the dexterous management of their leaders, and his victory over the tyrant Magnentius increased his inclination, as well as ability, to employ the arms of power in the cause of Arianism. While the two armies were engaged in the plains of Mursa, and the fate of the two rivals depended on the chance of war, the son of Constantine passed the anxious moments in a church of the martyrs under the walls of the city. His spiritual comforter, Valens, the Arian bishop of the diocese, employed the most artful precautions to obtain such early intelligence as might secure either his favor or his escape. A secret chain of swift and trusty messengers informed him of the vicissitudes of the battle, and while the courtiers stood trembling round their affrighted master, Valens assured him that the Gallic legions gave way, and insinuated with some presence of mind that the glorious event had been revealed to him by an angel. The grateful emperor ascribed his success to the merits and intercession of the bishop of Mursa, whose faith had deserved the public and miraculous approbation of heaven. 87. The Arians, who considered as their own the victory of Constantius, preferred his glory to that of his father. 88. Cyril, Bishop of Jerusalem, immediately composed the description of a celestial cross, encircled with a splendid rainbow, which during the festival of Pentecost, about the 3rd hour of the day, had appeared over the Mount of Olives, to the edification of the devout pilgrims and the people of the holy city. 89. The size of the meteor was gradually magnified, and the Arian historian has ventured to affirm that it was conspicuous to the two armies in the plains of Pannonia, and that the tyrant, who is purposely represented as an idolater, fled before the auspicious sign of Orthodox Christianity. 9085. Return. Quia etiam tum catechumenus, sacramentum fide merito videretu potuisse nesiar. Sub. Sever. Hist. Sacra. L. P. 410. 86. Return. Socrates. L2. Su Zomen. L3c. 18. Athanas. Tom. I. P. 813, 813, 834. He observes that the eunuchs are the natural enemies of the Aeson. Compare Dr. Jortin's remarks on ecclesiastical history, Volume Ave P3, with a certain genealogy in Candide, Ch. IV, which ends with one of the first companions of Christopher Columbus. 88. Return. Cheryl Apud Baron. AD 353, No. 26, expressly observes that in the reign of Constantine, the cross had been found in the bowels of the earth, but that it had appeared in the reign of Constantius in the midst of the heavens. This opposition evidently proves that Cyril was ignorant of the stupendous miracle to which the conversion of Constantine is attributed, and this ignorance is the more surprising, since it was no more than 12 years after his death that Cyril was consecrated Bishop of Jerusalem by the immediate successor of Eusebius of Caesarea. See Tillemont, Miem, Eccles Tom, vi. P. 715, 89. Return. It is not easy to determine how far the ingenuity of Cyril might be assisted by some natural appearances of a solar halo. 90. Return. Philostorgius, L3c. 26. He is followed by the author of the Alexandrian Chronicle, by Cedrenus and by Nicephorus. See Gothofrid, Dicet, P.K. Unber. 88. They could not refuse a miracle, even from the hand of an enemy. The sentiments of a judicious stranger who has impartially considered the progress of civil or ecclesiastical discord are always entitled to our notice, and a short passage of Ammianus, who served in the armies and studied the character of Constantius, is perhaps of more value than many pages of theological invectives. The Christian religion, which, in itself, says that moderate historian, is plain and simple, he confounded by the dotage of superstition. Instead of reconciling the parties by the weight of his authority, he cherished and promulgated by verbal disputes the differences which his vain curiosity had excited. The highways were covered with troops of bishops galloping from every side to the assemblies, which they call synods, and while they labored to reduce the whole sect to their own particular opinions, the public establishment of the posts was almost ruined by their hasty and repeated journeys. 91. Our more intimate knowledge of the ecclesiastical transactions of the reign of Constantius would furnish an ample commentary on this remarkable passage, which justifies the rational apprehensions of Athanasius that the restless activity of the clergy who wandered round the empire in search of the true faith would excite the contempt and laughter of the unbelieving world. 92. As soon as the emperor was relieved from the terrors of the civil war, he devoted the leisure of his winter quarters at Arles, Milan, Sirmium, and Constantinople to the amusement or toils of controversy. The sword of the magistrate, and even of the tyrant, was unsheathed to enforce the reasons of the theologian, and as he opposed the orthodox faith of Nice, it is readily confessed that his incapacity and ignorance were equal to his presumption. 93. The eunuchs, the women, and the bishops who governed the vain and feeble mind of the emperor had inspired him with an insuperable dislike to the homoousion, but his timid conscience was alarmed by the impiety of Aetius. The guilt of that atheist was aggravated by the suspicious favor of the unfortunate Gallus, and even the death of the imperial ministers, who had been massacred at Antioch, were imputed to the suggestions of that dangerous sophist. The mind of Constantius, which could neither be moderated by reason nor fixed by faith, was blindly impelled to either side of the dark and empty abyss by his horror of the opposite extreme. He alternately embraced and condemned the sentiments. He successively banished and recalled the leaders of the Arian and semi-Arian factions. 94. During the season of public business or festivity, he employed whole days and even nights in selecting the words and weighing the syllables which composed his fluctuating creeds. The subject of his meditations still pursued and occupied his slumbers. The incoherent dreams of the emperor were received as celestial visions, and he accepted with complacency the lofty title of Bishop of Bishops from those ecclesiastics who forgot the interest of their order for the gratification of their passions. The design of establishing a uniformity of doctrine, which had engaged him to convene so many synods in Gaul, Italy, Illyricum, and Asia, was repeatedly baffled by his own levity, by the divisions of the Arians, and by the resistance of the Catholics, and he resolved, as the last and decisive effort, imperiously to dictate the decrees of a general council. The destructive earthquake of Nicomedia, the difficulty of finding a convenient place, and perhaps some secret motives of policy, produced an alteration in the summons. The bishops of the East were directed to meet at Seleucia in Isauria, while those of the West held their deliberations at Rimini, on the coast of the Adriatic, and instead of 2 or 3 deputies from each province, the whole episcopal body was ordered to march. The Eastern Council, after consuming 4 days in fierce and unavailing debate, separated without any definitive conclusion. The Council of the West was protracted till the 7th month. Taurus, the Praetorian prefect, was instructed not to dismiss the prelates till they should all be united in the same opinion, and his efforts were supported by the power of banishing 15 of the most refractory, and a promise of the consulship if he achieved so difficult an adventure. His prayers and threats, the authority of the sovereign, the sophistry of Valens and Athanasius, the distress of cold and hunger, and the tedious melancholy of a hopeless exile, at length extorted the reluctant consent of the bishops of Rimini. The deputies of the East and of the West attended the emperor in the palace of Constantinople, and he enjoyed the satisfaction of imposing on the world a profession of faith which established the likeness, without expressing the consubstantiality, of the Son of God. 95. But the triumph of Arianism had been preceded by the removal of the Orthodox clergy, whom it was impossible either to intimidate or to corrupt, and the reign of Constantius was disgraced by the unjust and ineffectual persecution of the great Athanasius. 91. Return. So curious a passage well deserves to be transcribed. Christianum religionem absolutum et simplicem, analyse superstitione confundens, in quas scrutanda perplexius, quam componenda gravius excitaret desidia plurima, quae progressa fusius aluit concertatione verborum, ut catavis antistium jumentis publicis ultros atrocedis carentibus, per synodos quas appellant, dum ritum omnem ad suum Sahari conuntur, Valesius reads conatur, rae vehicularii consideret servos. Ammianus 2 Forns and 16, 94, Returns and Sozomen, L4C23, Athanas, Tum, IP 83-1, Tillamont, Mem Ecolus, Tum, Vihi P. 947 has collected several instances of the haughty fanaticism of Constantius from the detached treatises of Lucifer of Cagliari. The very titles of these treatises inspire zeal and terror. Mariendum pro Dei Filio, De regibus apostaticis, de non conveniendo cum heretico, de non passendo in deum delinquentibus, to 95 Returna Selp, Seva, Hist, Sacra, L2 p. 418-430. The Greek historians were very ignorant of the affairs of the West, to non conveniendo of the affairs of the West, to non comportative observing, either in active or speculative life, what effect may be produced or what obstacles may be surmounted by the force of a single mind when it is inflexibly applied to the pursuit of a single object. The immortal name of Athanasius 96 will never be separated from the Catholic doctrine of the Trinity, to whose defense he consecrated every moment and every faculty of his being. Educated in the family of Alexander, he had vigorously opposed the early progress of the Arian heresy. He exercised the important functions of secretary under the aged prelate, and the fathers of the Nicene Council beheld with surprise and respect the rising virtues of the young deacon. In a time of public danger, the dull claims of age and of rank are sometimes superseded, and within 5 months after his return from Nice, the deacon Athanasius was seated on the archiepiscopal throne of Egypt. He filled that eminent station above 46 years, and his long administration was spent in a perpetual combat against the powers of Arianism. 5 times was Athanasius expelled from his throne. 20 years he passed as an exile or a fugitive, and almost every province of the Roman Empire was successively witness to his merit and his sufferings in the cause of the homoousion, which he considered as the sole pleasure and business, as the duty and as the glory of his life. Amidst the storms of persecution, the Archbishop of Alexandria was patient of labor, jealous of fame, careless of safety, and although his mind was tainted by the contagion of fanaticism, Athanasius displayed a superiority of character and abilities which would have qualified him, far better than the degenerate sons of Constantine, for the government of a great monarchy. His learning was much less profound and extensive than that of Eusebius of Caesarea, and his rude eloquence could not be compared with the polished oratory of Gregory of Basil, but whenever the primate of Egypt was called upon to justify his sentiments or his conduct, his unpremeditated style, either of speaking or writing, was clear, forcible, and persuasive. He has always been revered in the Orthodox school as one of the most accurate masters of the Christian theology, and he was supposed to possess 2 profane sciences, less adapted to the episcopal character, the knowledge of jurisprudence, 97, and that of divination, 98. Some fortunate conjectures of future events, which impartial reasoners might ascribe to the experience and judgment of Athanasius, were attributed by his friends to heavenly inspiration and imputed by his enemies to infernal magic. 96. Return. We may regret that Gregory Nazianzen composed a panegyric instead of a life of Athanasius, but we should enjoy and improve the advantage of drawing our most authentic materials from the rich fund of his own epistles and apologies. Tom. IP 670-951. I shall not imitate the example of Socrates, EL2CTL, who published the first edition of the History, without giving himself the trouble to consult the writings of Athanasius. Yet even Socrates, the more curious Sozomen, and the learned Theodoret connect the life of Athanasius with the series of ecclesiastical history. The diligence of Tillemont, Tom. 8, and of the Benedictine editors has collected every fact and examined every difficulty. 97. Return. Sulpicius Severus Huist. Sacra, L2p. 39-6 calls him a lawyer, a jurisconsult. This character cannot now be discovered either in the life or writings of Athanasius. 98. Return. Dicebitur enim fatidicarum sortium fidem, quaev augurales portenderant alites scientissime calens aliquities praedixisi futura. Ammianus 15:7. A prophecy, or rather a joke, is related by Sozomen, L4c. 10, which evidently proves, if the crows speak Latin, that Athanasius understood the language of the crows. But as Athanasius was continually engaged with the prejudices and passions of every order of men, from the monk to the emperor, the knowledge of human nature was his first and most important science. He preserved a distinct and unbroken view of a scene which was incessantly shifting, and never failed to improve those decisive moments which are irrecoverably past before they are perceived by a common eye. The Archbishop of Alexandria was capable of distinguishing how far he might boldly command, and where he must dexterously insinuate, how long he might contend with power, and when he must withdraw from persecution, and while he directed the thunders of the Church against heresy and rebellion, he could assume, in the bosom of his own party, the flexible and indulgent temper of a prudent leader. The election of Athanasius has not escaped the reproach of irregularity and precipitation, 99, but the propriety of his behavior conciliated the affections both of the clergy and of the people. The Alexandrians were impatient to rise in arms for the defense of an eloquent and liberal pastor. In his distress, he always derived support, or at least consolation, from the faithful attachment of his parochial clergy, and the 100 bishops of Egypt adhered with unshaken zeal to the cause of Athanasius. In the modest equipage which pride and policy would effect, he frequently performed the episcopal visitation of his provinces, from the mouth of the Nile to the confines of Ethiopia, familiarly conversing with the meanest of the populace, and humbly saluting the saints and hermits of the desert. 100. Nor was it only in ecclesiastical assemblies, among men whose education and manners were similar to his own, that Athanasius displayed the ascendancy of his genius. He appeared with easy and respectful firmness in the courts of princes, and in the various turns of his prosperous and adverse fortune. He never lost the confidence of his friends or the esteem of his enemies. 99. Return. The irregular ordination of Athanasius was slightly mentioned in the councils which were held against him. See Philostorg, L2c. 11, and Godefroy p. 71, but it can scarcely be supposed that the assembly of the bishops of Egypt would solemnly attest a public falsehood. Athanas, Tom, IP 726, which etc. 2100, return might return. See the History of the Fathers of the Desert, published by Roswide, and Tillamont, Mem. Eccles, Tom, v. In the Wives of Antony, Hashomius, and c. Athanasius himself, who did not disdain to compose the life of his friend Antony, has carefully observed how often the holy monk deplored and prophesied the mischiefs of the Arian heresy. Athanas. 2 p. 492, 498 NC. In his youth, the primate of Egypt resisted the great Constantine, who had repeatedly signified his will that Arius should be restored to the Catholic communion. Gen. 1. The emperor respected and might forgive this inflexible resolution, and the faction who considered Athanasius as their most formidable enemy was constrained to dissemble their hatred and silently to prepare an indirect and distant assault. They scattered rumors and suspicions, represented the archbishop as a proud and oppressive tyrant, and boldly accused him of violating the treaty which had been ratified in the Nicene Council with the schismatic followers of Meletius. Now, Athanasius had openly disapproved that ignominious peace, and the emperor was disposed to believe that he had abused his ecclesiastical and civil power to prosecute those odious sectaries, that he had sacrilegiously broken a chalice in one of their churches of Merotis, that he had whipped or imprisoned 6 of their bishops, and that Arsenius, a 7th bishop of the same party, had been murdered or at least mutilated by the cruel hand of the primate. 10.3. These charges, which affected his honor and his life, were referred by Constantine to his brother Dalmatius, the censor, who resided at Antioch. The synods of Caesarea and Tyre were successively convened, and the bishops of the East were instructed to judge the cause of Athanasius before they proceeded to consecrate the new church of the resurrection at Jerusalem. The primate might be conscious of his innocence, but he was sensible that the same implacable spirit which had dictated the accusation would direct the proceeding and pronounce the sentence. He prudently declined the tribunal of his enemies, despised the summons of the Synod of Caesarea, and, after a long and artful delay, submitted to the peremptory commands of the emperor, who threatened to punish his criminal disobedience if he refused to appear in the Council of Tyre. 9.4. Before Athanasius, at the head of 50 Egyptian prelates, sailed from Alexandria, he had wisely secured the alliance of the Meletians, and Arsenius himself, his imaginary victim and his secret friend, was privately concealed in his train. The Synod of Tyre was conducted by Eusebius of Caesarea, with more passion and with less art than his learning and experience might promise. His numerous faction repeated the names of homicide and tyrant, and their clamors were encouraged by the seeming patience of Athanasius, who expected the decisive moment to produce Arsenius alive and unhurt in the midst of the assembly. The nature of the other charges did not admit of such clear and satisfactory replies, yet the archbishop was able to prove that in the village, where he was accused of breaking a consecrated chalice, neither church nor altar nor chalice could really exist. The Arians, who had secretly determined the guilt and condemnation of their enemy, attempted, however, to disguise their injustice by the imitation of judicial forms. The synod appointed an episcopal commission of 6 delegates to collect evidence on the spot, and this measure, which was vigorously opposed by the Egyptian bishops, opened new scenes of violence and perjury. 1905. After the return of the deputies from Alexandria, the majority of the council pronounced the final sentence of degradation and exile against the primate of Egypt. The decree, expressed in the fiercest language of malice and revenge, was communicated to the emperor and the Catholic Church, and the bishops immediately resumed a mild and devout aspect, such as became their holy pilgrimage to the sepulchre of Christ. 106. Enundran return. At first Constantine threatened in speaking, but requested in writing. His letters gradually assumed a menacing tone. While he required that the entrance of the church should be open to all, he avoided the odious name of Arius. Athanasius, like a skillful politician, has accurately marked these distinctions. Tom. IP. 788, which allowed him some scope for excuse and delay. To return. The Milesians in Egypt, like the Donatists in Africa, were produced by an episcopal quarrel which arose from the persecution. I have not leisure to pursue the obscure controversy, which seems to have been misrepresented by the partiality of Athanasius and the ignorance of Epiphanius. See Moschheim's General History of the Church, Volume IP 201, 93. Return. The treatment of the 6 bishops is specified by Sozomen, LL 2c. 25, but Athanasius himself, so copious on the subject of Arsenius and the chalice, leaves this grave accusation without a reply. Note, this grave charge, if made, and it rests entirely on the authority of Sozomen, seems to have been silently dropped by the parties themselves. It is never alluded to in the subsequent investigations. From Sozomen himself, who gives the unfavorable report of the Commission of Inquiry sent to Egypt concerning the cup, it does not appear that they noticed this accusation of personal violence. Mien 1 return. Athanasius, Tom. IP 788. Socrates, LIC 28. Sozomen, L2C 25. The Emperor, in his Epistle of Convocation, Eusebia. Inviti, Constant, Li Iv. C. 42, seems to prejudge some members of the clergy, and it was more than probable that the synod would apply those reproaches to Athanasius. Number COWC, number CC. In particular, the second apology of Athanasius, Tom. IP 763W8, and his epistles to the monks, PE 8W8, 8666. They are justified by original and authentic documents, but they would inspire more confidence if he appeared less innocent and his enemies less absurd. Chapter 21. Persecution of Heresy, State of the Church. Part 5. But the injustice of these ecclesiastical judges had not been countenanced by the submission, or even by the presence, of Athanasius. He resolved to make a bold and dangerous experiment, whether the throne was inaccessible to the voice of truth, and before the final sentence could be pronounced at Tyre, the intrepid primate threw himself into a bark which was ready to hoist sail for the imperial city. The request of a formal audience might have been opposed or eluded, but Athanasius concealed his arrival, watched the moment of Constantine's return from an adjacent villa, and boldly encountered his angry sovereign as he passed on horseback through the principal street of Constantinople. So strange an apparition excited his surprise and indignation, and the guards were ordered to remove the importunate suitor. But his resentment was subdued by involuntary respect, and the haughty spirit of the emperor was awed by the courage and eloquence of a bishop who implored his justice and awakened his conscience. 1007 Constantine listened to the complaints of Athanasius with impartial and even gracious attention. The members of the Synod of Tyre were summoned to justify their proceedings, and the arts of the Eusebian faction would have been confounded if they had not aggravated the guilt of the primate by the dexterous supposition of an unpardonable offense, a criminal designed to intercept and detain the corn fleet of Alexandria, which supplied the subsistence of the new capital. Tononate. The emperor was satisfied that the peace of Egypt would be secured by the absence of a popular leader, but he refused to fill the vacancy of the archiepiscopal throne, and the sentence, which, after long hesitation he pronounced, was that of a jealous ostracism rather than of an ignominious exile. In the remote province of Gaul, but in the hospitable court of Treves, Athanasius passed about 28 months. The death of the emperor changed the face of public affairs and, amidst the general indulgence of a young reign, the primate was restored to his country by an honorable edict of the younger Constantine, who expressed a deep sense of the innocence and merit of his venerable guest. 10:927 Return. Athanasius, Tom. IP 804. In a church dedicated to St. Athanasius, this situation would afford a better subject for a picture than most of the stories of miracles and martyrdoms. Might under 10, Return. Athanasius, Tom. IP 729. Eunapius has related, in Vite, Sophist, p. 36-37, edit. Commelin, a strange example of the cruelty and credulity of Constantine on a similar occasion. The eloquent Sopater, a Syrian philosopher, enjoyed his friendship and provoked the resentment of Oblavius, his praetorian prefect. The corn fleet was detained for want of a south wind, the people of Constantinople were discontented, and Sopater was beheaded on a charge that he had bound the winds by the power of magic. Suidas adds that Constantine wished to prove, by this execution, that he had absolutely renounced the superstition of the Gentiles. Number 9 Return. In his return he saw Constantius twice, at Viminaicum and at Caesarea in Cappadocia. Athanasius, Tom. IP 676. Tillemont supposes that Constantine introduced him to the meeting of the three royal brothers in Pannonia. Memoirs Eccles. Tom. 8. p. 69. The death of that prince exposed Athanasius to a second persecution, and the feeble Constantius, the sovereign of the East, soon became the secret accomplice of the Eusebians. 90 bishops of that sect or faction assembled at Antioch under the specious pretense of dedicating the cathedral. They composed an ambiguous creed which is faintly tinged with the colors of semi-Arianism, and 25 canons which still regulate the discipline of the Orthodox Greeks. 110. It was decided, with some appearance of equity, that a bishop, deprived by a synod, should not resume his episcopal functions till he had been absolved by the judgment of an equal synod. The law was immediately applied to the case of Athanasius. The Council of Antioch pronounced, or rather confirmed, his degradation. A stranger named Gregory was seated on his throne, and Philagrius, I11 the prefect of Egypt, was instructed to support the new primate with the civil and military powers of the province. Oppressed by the conspiracy of the Asiatic prelates, Athanasius withdrew from Alexandria and passed 3 years 112 as an exile and a suppliant on the holy threshold of the Vatican. 11.3. By the assiduous study of the Latin language, he soon qualified himself to negotiate with the Western clergy. His decent flattery swayed and directed the haughty Julius. The Roman pontiff was persuaded to consider his appeal as the peculiar interest of the Apostolic See, and his innocence was unanimously declared in a council of 50 bishops of Italy. At the end of 3 years, the primate was summoned to the court of Milan by the Emperor Constans, who, in the indulgence of unlawful pleasures, still professed a lively regard for the Orthodox faith. The cause of truth and justice was promoted by the influence of gold, Eleven-Forn, and the ministers of Constans advised their sovereign to require the convocation of an ecclesiastical assembly, which might act as the representatives of the Catholic Church. 94 bishops of the West, 76 bishops of the East, encountered each other at Sardica, on the verge of the two empires, but in the dominions of the protector of Athanasius. Their debates soon degenerated into hostile altercations. The Asiatics, apprehensive for their personal safety, retired to Philippopolis in Thrace, and the rival synods reciprocally hurled their spiritual thunders against their enemies, whom they piously condemned as the enemies of the true God. Their decrees were published and ratified in their respective provinces, and Athanasius, who in the West was revered as a saint, was exposed as a criminal to the abhorrence of the East. 11.15. The Council of Sardica reveals the first symptoms of discord and schism between the Greek and Latin churches, which were separated by the accidental difference of faith and the permanent distinction of language. 110. Return, Puridge Pandect, Tom, IP 429452 and Tom, II, Annotation, P 82, Tillemont Mem, Eccles, Tom, Vi, P 310.324. Saint Hilary of Poitiers has mentioned this synod of Antioch with too much favor and respect. He reckons 97 bishops. 101 Return. This magistrate, so odious to Athanasius, is praised by Gregory Nazianzen, Tom, I, Orat, 21.390, 390, 390, 30 Ofert, Deus alter opum. For the credit of human nature, I am always pleased to discover some good qualities in those men whom party has represented as tyrants and monsters. Tu a predictated by Valesius at Rome, are strenuously agitated by Valesius, tu o velibits andae the Poitiers confronte with tu, II, hist, Eccles, Liic, 1.5, and Tillemont, men, Eccles, Tom, Vi, p. 674, and c. I have followed the simple hypothesis of Valesius, who allows only one journey. After the intrusion, Gregory, 1113, return. I cannot forbear transcribing a judicious observation of Wettstein, Prolegomen, NSP. 19. Si tamen historiam ecclesiasticum velimus consulare, patabit jam inde a seculo quarto, cum, ortis controversias, ecclesiae gratiae doctors in duas partes, cinderentur, ingenio, eloquentia, numero, tantum non aequales, impartum quae vincere cupiabat, Romam confugisi, majestatemque pontificis comiter colovici. Ioque pacto oppressis per pontificim et episcopos latinos adversarius praevaluisi, atque orthodoxiam in conciliis stabilivici. Iam ob causam Athanasius non sine comitatu Roman petiti pluresc annos ibi hesit. Nom 13 return. Philostorgius L3c. 12. If any corruption was used to promote the interest of religion, an advocate of Athanasius might justify or excuse this questionable conduct by the example of Cato and Sidney, the former of whom is said to have given, and the latter to have received, a bribe in the cause of liberty. 115 Return. The canon which allows appeals to the Roman pontiffs has almost raised the Council of Sardica to the dignity of a general council, and its acts have been ignorantly or artfully confounded with those of the Nicene Synod. See Tillemont, Tom, VIP, p. 689, and Geddes' Tracts, Vol. 2, pp. 479 to 460. During his second exile in the West, Athanasius was frequently admitted to the imperial presence at Capua, Lodi, Milan, Verona, Padua, Aquileia, and Treves. The bishop of the diocese usually assisted at these interviews. The master of the offices stood before the veil or curtain of the sacred apartment, and the uniform moderation of the primate might be attested by these respectable witnesses, to whose evidence he solemnly appeals. Ellen 16 Prudence would undoubtedly suggest the mild and respectful tone that became a subject and a bishop. In these familiar conferences with the sovereign of the West, Athanasius might lament the error of Constantius, but he boldly arraigned the guilt of his eunuchs and his Arian prelates, deplored the distress and danger of the Catholic Church, and excited Constans to emulate the zeal and glory of his father. The emperor declared his resolution of employing the troops and treasures of Europe in the Orthodox cause, and signified by a concise and peremptory epistle to his brother Constantius that unless he consented to the immediate restoration of Athanasius, he himself, with a fleet and army, would seat the archbishop on the throne of Alexandria. 117. But this religious war, so horrible to nature, was prevented by the timely compliance of Constantius, and the Emperor of the East condescended to solicit a reconciliation with a subject whom he had injured. Athanasius waited with decent pride till he had received 3 successive epistles full of the strongest assurances of the protection, the favor, and the esteem of his sovereign, who invited him to resume his episcopal seat, and who added the humiliating precaution of engaging his principal ministers to attest the sincerity of his intentions. They were manifested in a still more public manner by the strict orders which were dispatched into Egypt to recall the adherents of Athanasius, to restore their privileges, to proclaim their innocence, and to erase from the public registers the illegal proceedings which had been obtained during the prevalence of the Eusebian faction. After every satisfaction and security had been given, which justice or even delicacy could require, the primate proceeded, by slow journeys, through the provinces of Thrace, Asia, and Syria, and his progress was marked by the abject homage of the Oriental bishops, who excited his contempt without deceiving his penetration. 1 Sender 8. At Antioch he saw the Emperor Constantius, sustained with modest firmness the embraces and protestations of his master, and eluded the proposal of allowing the Arians a single church at Alexandria, by claiming, in the other cities of the empire, a similar toleration for his own party, a reply which might have appeared just and moderate in the mouth of an independent prince. The entrance of the archbishop into his capital was a triumphal procession. Absence and persecution had endeared him to the Alexandrians. His authority, which he exercised with rigor, was more firmly established, and his fame was diffused from Ethiopia to Britain over the whole extent of the Christian world. Ireland 19, Allen 16, return. As Athanasius dispersed secret invectives against Constantius, see the Epistle to the Monks, at the same time that he assured him of his profound respect, we might distrust the professions of the Archbishop. Tom. IP 67-7, 915 return, notwithstanding the discreet silence of Athanasius and the manifest forgery of a letter inserted by Socrates. These menaces are proved by the unquestionable evidence of Lucifer of Cagliari and even of Constantius himself. See Tillemont, Tom. 8p6, 913 return, 11.8 return. I have always entertained some doubts concerning the retraction of Arcesius and Valens. Athanasius. Tom. IP. 776. Their epistles to Julius, Bishop of Rome, and to Athanasius himself are of so different a cast from each other that they cannot both be genuine. The one speaks the language of criminals who confess their guilt and infamy, the other of enemies who solicit on equal terms an honorable reconciliation. Note, I cannot quite comprehend the ground of Gibbon's doubts. Athanasius distinctly asserts the fact of their retractation. Athan. Op. I. P24. Edit. Benedict. The epistles are apparently translations from the Latin, if, in fact, more than the substance of the epistles. That to Athanasius is brief, almost abrupt. The retractation is likewise mentioned in the address of the Orthodox bishops of Rimini to Constantius. Athan. De Synodis, Optip 723 M99 Rin. 19 turn may be collected from Athanasius himself. Tom. IP 769 and 822 843. Socrates L22 C18 Sozomen L22 18 Sozomen L true C18. Theodoret L22 AT2 12. But the subject who has reduced his prince to the necessity of dissembling can never expect a sincere and lasting forgiveness, and the tragic fate of Constans soon deprived Athanasius of a powerful and generous protector. The civil war between the assassin and the only surviving brother of Constans, which afflicted the empire above 3 years, secured an interval of repose to the Catholic Church, and the two contending parties were desirous to conciliate the friendship of a bishop who, by the weight of his personal authority, might determine the fluctuating resolutions of an important province. He gave audience to the ambassadors of the tyrant, with whom he was afterwards accused of holding a secret correspondence. 20 and the Emperor Constantius repeatedly assured his dearest father, the most reverend Athanasius, that, notwithstanding the malicious rumors which were circulated by their common enemies, he had inherited the sentiments as well as the throne of his deceased brother. 21. Gratitude and humanity would have disposed the primate of Egypt to deplore the untimely fate of Constans, and to abhor the guilt of Magnentius. But as he clearly understood that the apprehensions of Constantius were his only safeguard, the fervor of his prayers for the success of the righteous cause might perhaps be somewhat abated. The ruin of Athanasius was no longer contrived by the obscure malice of a few bigoted or angry bishops who abused the authority of a credulous monarch. The monarch himself avowed the resolution which he had so long suppressed of avenging his private injuries. 122, when the first winter after his victory, which he passed at Arles, was employed against an enemy more odious to him than the vanquished tyrant of Gaul. 120 return Athanasius Tom, IP 6077, 6078, defends his innocence by pathetic complaints, solemn assertions, and specious arguments. He admits that letters had been forged in his name, but he requests that his own secretaries and those of the tyrant might be examined, whether those letters had been written by the former or received by the latter. 22 return. Athanasius Tom, IP 86-1. Theodoret, L2C Chi. The emperor declared that he was more desirous to subdue Athanasius than he had been to vanquish Magnentius or Silvanus. If the emperor had capriciously decreed the death of the most eminent and virtuous citizen of the Republic, the cruel order would have been executed without hesitation by the ministers of open violence or of specious injustice. The caution, the delay, the difficulty with which he proceeded in the condemnation and punishment of a popular bishop discovered to the world that the privileges of the Church had already revived a sense of order and freedom in the Roman government. The sentence, which was pronounced in the Synod of Tyre and subscribed by a large majority of the Eastern bishops, had never been expressly repealed, and as Athanasius had been once degraded from his episcopal dignity by the judgment of his brethren, every subsequent act might be considered as irregular and even criminal. But the memory of the firm and effectual support which the primate of Egypt had derived from the attachment of the Western Church engaged Constantius to suspend the execution of the sentence till he had obtained the concurrence of the Latin bishops. 2 years were consumed in ecclesiastical negotiations, and the important cause between the emperor and one of his subjects was solemnly debated, first in the Synod of Arles, and afterwards in the great Council of Milan, 1203, which consisted of above 300 bishops. Their integrity was gradually undermined by the arguments of the Arians, the dexterity of the eunuchs, and the pressing solicitations of a prince who gratified his revenge at the expense of his dignity and exposed his own passions, whilst he influenced those of the clergy. Corruption, the most infallible symptom of constitutional liberty, was successfully practiced. Honors, gifts, and immunities were offered and accepted as the price of an episcopal vote, 144, and the condemnation of the Alexandrian primate was artfully represented as the only measure which could restore the peace and union of the Catholic Church. The friends of Athanasius were not, however, wanting to their leader or to their cause. With a manly spirit which the sanctity of their character rendered less dangerous, they maintained in public debate and in private conference with the emperor the eternal obligation of religion and justice. They declared that neither the hope of his favor nor the fear of his displeasure should prevail on them to join in the condemnation of an absent, an innocent, a respectable brother. 25, they affirmed with apparent reason that the illegal and obsolete decrees of the Council of Tyre had long since been tacitly abolished by the imperial edicts, the honorable re-establishment of the Archbishop of Alexandria, and the silence or recantation of his most clamorous adversaries. They alleged that his innocence had been attested by the unanimous bishops of Egypt and had been acknowledged in the councils of Rome and Sardica, 116, by the impartial judgment of the Latin Church. They deplored the hard condition of Athanasius, who, after enjoying so many years his seat, his reputation, and the seeming confidence of his sovereign, was again called upon to confute the most groundless and extravagant accusations. Their language was specious, their conduct was honorable, but in this long and obstinate contest which fixed the eyes of the whole empire on a single bishop, the ecclesiastical factions were prepared to sacrifice truth and justice to the more interesting object of defending or removing the intrepid champion of the Nicene faith. The Arians still thought it prudent to disguise, in ambiguous language, their real sentiments and designs, But the Orthodox bishops, armed with the favor of the people and the decrees of a general council, insisted on every occasion, and particularly at Milan, that their adversaries should purge themselves from the suspicion of heresy before they presumed to arraign the conduct of the great Athanasius. 27-23 return. The affairs of the Council of Milan are so imperfectly and erroneously related by the Greek writers that we must rejoice in the supply of some letters of Eusebius, extracted by Baronius from the archives of the Church of Vercellae, and of an old life of Dionysius of Milan, published by Bollandus. See Baronius, A.D. 355, and Tillemont, Tom, VIEP 1415-224 return. The honors, presents, feasts which seduced so many bishops are mentioned with indignation by those who were too pure or too proud to accept them. We combat, says Hilary of Poitiers, against Constantius the Antichrist, who strokes the belly instead of scourging the back, qui non dorsa caedit, sed ventrum palpat. Hilarius, contra Constant, c. 5p 2040, 2014-25. Return 25 return. Something of this opposition is mentioned by Ammianus Ecclesiastic, Ecclesiastical History. Liberius, perseveranter anitebatur, nec visum hominem, nec auditum damnare, nefas ultimum saip exclamans, aperte siliset recalcitrans, imperatoris arbitrio, idanim ille Athanasio semper infestus, and c. 126 return. More properly, by the orthodox part of the Council of Sardica. If the bishops of both parties had fairly voted, the division would have been 94-76. M. de Tillemont, C. Tom. V. 1147-1158. Is justly surprised that so small a majority should have proceeded as vigorously against their adversaries, the principal of whom they immediately deposed. But the voice of reason, if reason was indeed on the side of Athanasius, was silenced by the clamors of a factious or venal majority, and the councils of Arles and Milan were not dissolved till the Archbishop of Alexandria had been solemnly condemned and deposed by the judgment of the Western as well as of the Eastern Church. The bishops who had opposed were required to subscribe the sentence and to unite in religious communion with the suspected leaders of the adverse party. A formulary of consent was transmitted by the messengers of state to the absent bishops, and all those who refused to submit their private opinion to the public and inspired wisdom of the councils of Arles and Milan were immediately banished by the emperor, who affected to execute the decrees of the Catholic Church. Among those prelates who led the honorable band of confessors and exiles, Liberius of Rome, Osius of Cordova, Paulinus of Treves, Dionysius of Milan, Eusebius of Vercellae, Lucifer of Cagliari, and Hilary of Poitiers may deserve to be particularly distinguished. The eminent station of Liberius, who governed the capital of the empire, the personal merit and long experience of the venerable Osius, who was revered as the favorite of the great Constantine, and the father of the Nicene faith, placed those prelates at the head of the Latin Church, and their example, either of submission or resistance, would probably be imitated by the episcopal crowd. But the repeated attempts of the emperor to seduce or to intimidate the bishops of Rome and Cordova were for some time ineffectual. The Spaniard declared himself ready to suffer under Constantius, as he had suffered 60 years before under his grandfather Maximian. The Roman, in the presence of his sovereign, asserted the innocence of Athanasius and his own freedom. When he was banished to Berea in Thrace, he sent back a large sum which had been offered for the accommodation of his journey, and insulted the court of Milan by the haughty remark that the emperor and his eunuchs might want that gold to pay their soldiers and their bishops. 28. The resolution of Liberius and Osius was at length subdued by the hardships of exile and confinement. The Roman pontiff purchased his return by some criminal compliances, and afterwards expiated his guilt by a seasonable repentance. Persuasion and violence were employed to extort the reluctant signature of the decrepit Bishop of Cordova, whose strength was broken and whose faculties were perhaps impaired by the weight of 100 years, and the insolent triumph of the Arians provoked some of the Orthodox party to treat with inhuman severity the character, or rather the memory, of an unfortunate old man to whose former services Christianity itself was so deeply indebted. 29. The exile of Liberius is mentioned by Ammianus, 15:7, C. Theodoret, L2c, 16, Athanasius, 2, IP 834-837, Hilar, Fragment L29, Return. The life of Ossius is collected by Tillemont, Nom. Vic. 524561, who in the most extravagant terms first admires and then reprobates the Bishop of Cordova. In the midst of their lamentations on his fall, the prudence of Athanasius may be distinguished from the blind and intemperate zeal of Hilary. The fall of Liberius and Ossius reflected a brighter luster on the firmness of those bishops who still adhered, with unshaken fidelity, to the cause of Athanasius and religious truth. The ingenious malice of their enemies had deprived them of the benefit of mutual comfort and advice, separated those illustrious exiles into distant provinces, and carefully selected the most inhospitable spots of a great empire. 30. Yet they soon experienced that the deserts of Libya and the most barbarous tracts of Cappadocia were less inhospitable than the residents of those cities in which an Arian bishop could satiate without restraint the exquisite rancor of theological hatred. 31. Their consolation was derived from the consciousness of rectitude and independence, from the applause, the visits, the letters, and the liberal alms of their adherents. 32. And from the satisfaction which they soon enjoyed of observing the intestine divisions of the adversaries of the Nicene faith. Such was the nice and capricious taste of the Emperor Constantius, and so easily was he offended by the slightest deviation from his imaginary standard of Christian truth, that he persecuted with equal zeal those who defended the consubstantiality, those who asserted the similar substance, and those who denied the likeness of the Son of God. 3 bishops, degraded and banished for those adverse opinions, might possibly meet in the same place of exile, and, according to the difference of their temper, might either pity or insult the blind enthusiasm of their antagonists, whose present sufferings would never be compensated by future happiness. The Huntry return. The confessors of the West were successively banished to the deserts of Arabia or Thebes, the lonely places of Mount Taurus, the wildest parts of Phrygia, which were in the possession of the impious Montanists, and When the heretic Aetius was too favorably entertained at Mopsuestia in Cilicia, the place of his exile was changed, by the advice of Acacius, to Amblada, a district inhabited by savages and infested by war and pestilence. Philostorg. LVC. Philostorg. LVC. 2-131. Return. 31. Return. See the cruel treatment and strange obstinacy of Eusebius in his own letters published by Baronius, AD 356, number 92, 1.2. Return. Maxaci Secrest, Secetorum exuals Satirum exuals, sedis constat, totius orbis studius celebratos pecuniasque, ec in sumptum affatim congestas, legationibus quoque plebis Catholicae ex omnibus, fera provincias frequentatos. Sulp, Severhist, Sacra, p. 414, Athanasius, Tom, I, p. 836-840. The disgrace and exile of the Orthodox bishops of the West were designed as so many preparatory steps to the ruin of Athanasius himself. 133, 26 months had elapsed, during which the imperial court secretly labored by the most insidious arts to remove him from Alexandria and to withdraw the allowance which supplied his popular liberality. But when the primate of Egypt, deserted and proscribed by the Latin Church, was left destitute of any foreign support, Constantius dispatched 2 of his secretaries with a verbal commission to announce and execute the order of his banishment. As the justice of the sentence was publicly avowed by the whole party, the only motive which could restrain Constantius from giving his messengers the sanction of a written mandate must be imputed to his doubt of the event, and to a sense of the danger to which he might expose the second city and the most fertile province of the empire, if the people should persist in the resolution of defending, by force of arms, the innocence of their spiritual father. Such extreme caution afforded Athanasius a specious pretense respectfully to dispute the truth of an order which he could not reconcile either with the equity or with the former declarations of his gracious master. The civil powers of Egypt found themselves inadequate to the task of persuading or compelling the primate to abdicate his episcopal throne, and they were obliged to conclude a treaty with the popular leaders of Alexandria by which it was stipulated that all proceedings and all hostilities should be suspended till the emperor's pleasure had been more distinctly ascertained. By this seeming moderation, the Catholics were deceived into a false and fatal security, while the legions of the Upper Egypt and of Libya advanced by secret orders and hasty marches to besiege, or rather to surprise, a capital habituated to sedition and inflamed by religious zeal. 13.4. The position of Alexandria, between the sea and the Lake Marotis, facilitated the approach and landing of the troops, who were introduced into the heart of the city before any effectual measures could be taken, either to shut the gates or to occupy the important posts of defense. At the hour of midnight, 23 days after the signature of the treaty, Syrianus, Duke of Egypt, at the head of 5,000 soldiers, armed and prepared for an assault, unexpectedly invested the church of St. Theonas, where the archbishop, with a part of his clergy and people, performed their nocturnal devotions. The doors of the sacred edifice yielded to the impetuosity of the attack, which was accompanied with every horrid circumstance of tumult and bloodshed, but, as the bodies of the slain and the fragments of military weapons remained the next day an unexceptionable evidence in the possession of the Catholics, the enterprise of Syrianus may be considered as a successful irruption rather than as an absolute conquest. The other churches of the city were profaned by similar outrages, and, during at least 4 months, Alexandria was exposed to the insults of a licentious army, stimulated by the ecclesiastics of a hostile faction. Many of the faithful were killed, who may deserve the name of martyrs, if their deaths were neither provoked nor revenged. Bishops and presbyters were treated with cruel ignominy. Consecrated virgins were stripped naked, scourged and violated, the houses of wealthy citizens were plundered, and, under the mask of religious zeal, lust, avarice, and private resentment were gratified with impunity and even with applause. The pagans of Alexandria, who still formed a numerous and discontented party, were easily persuaded to desert a bishop whom they feared and esteemed. The hopes of some peculiar favors and the apprehension of being involved in the general penalties of rebellion engaged them to promise their support to the destined successor of Athanasius, the famous George of Cappadocia. The usurper, after receiving the consecration of an Arian synod, was placed on the episcopal throne by the arms of Sebastian, who had been appointed Count of Egypt for the execution of that important design. In the use, as well as in the acquisition of power, the tyrant, George disregarded the laws of religion, of justice, and of humanity, and the same scenes of violence and scandal which had been exhibited in the capital were repeated in more than 90 episcopal cities of Egypt. Encouraged by success, Constantius ventured to approve the conduct of his minister. By a public and passionate epistle, the emperor congratulates the deliverance of Alexandria from a popular tyrant who deluded his blind votaries by the magic of his eloquence, expatiates on the virtues and piety of the most reverend George, the elected bishop, and aspires as the patron and benefactor of the city to surpass the fame of Alexander himself. But he solemnly declares his unalterable resolution to pursue with fire and sword the seditious adherents of the wicked Athanasius, who, by flying from justice, has confessed his guilt and escaped the ignominious death which he had so often deserved. 35:43. Return. Ample materials for the history of this third persecution of Athanasius may be found in his own works. See particularly his very able apology to Constantius, Tom, IP 673, his first apology for his flight, p. 71, his prolix epistle to the Solitaries, p. 88, and the original protest of the people of Alexandria against the violences committed by Syrianus, p. 866. Sozomen, L4, key 9, has thrown into the narrative 2 or 3 luminous and important circumstances. 2033 return. Athanasius had lately sent for Antony and some of his chosen monks. They descended from their mountains, announced to the Alexandrians the sanctity of Athanasius, and were honorably conducted by the archbishop as far as the gates of the city. Athanas Tom, 2, p. 491, 492. See likewise Rufinus, 3, 1 Dindati, 4, in VTA, PTR, p. 524, 1 4 Daughtry 4, the Antati, 44. The emperor or his Arian secretaries, while they express their resentment, betray their fears and esteem of Athanasius. Chapter 21, Persecution of Heresy, State of the Church. Part 6. Athanasius had indeed escaped from the most imminent dangers, and the adventures of that extraordinary man deserve and fix our attention. On the memorable night when the Church of St. Theonas was invested by the troops of Syrianus, the archbishop, seated on his throne, expected with calm and intrepid dignity the approach of death. While the public devotion was interrupted by shouts of rage and cries of terror, he animated his trembling congregation to express their religious confidence by chanting one of the Psalms of David, which celebrates the triumph of the God of Israel over the haughty and impious tyrant of Egypt. The doors were at length burst open. A cloud of arrows was discharged among the people. The soldiers, with drawn swords, rushed forwards into the sanctuary, and the dreadful gleam of their arms was reflected by the holy luminaries which burnt round the altar. 36. Athanasius still rejected the pious importunity of the monks and presbyters who were attached to his person, and nobly refused to desert his episcopal station till he had dismissed in safety the last of the congregation. The darkness and tumult of the night favored the retreat of the archbishop, and though he was oppressed by the waves of an agitated multitude, though he was thrown to the ground and left without sense or motion, he still recovered his undaunted courage and eluded the eager search of the soldiers, who were instructed by their Arian guides that the head of Athanasius would be the most acceptable present to the emperor. From that moment, the primate of Egypt disappeared from the eyes of his enemies, and remained above 6 years concealed in impenetrable obscurity. 37-36 Return. These minute circumstances are curious, as they are literally transcribed from the protest, which was publicly presented 3 days afterwards by the Catholics of Alexandria. See Athanas, Tom, LNA. 80-67 Return. The Chansonists have often compared Athanasius and Arnold, and have expatiated with pleasure on the faith and zeal, the merit and exile of those celebrated doctors. This concealed parallel is very dexterously managed by the Abbé de la Bletterie via de Jovian, Tom, ICP, Towers. The despotic power of his implacable enemy filled the whole extent of the Roman world, and the exasperated monarch had endeavored, by a very pressing epistle to the Christian princes of Ethiopia, 1371-1, to exclude Athanasius from the most remote and sequestered regions of the earth. Counts, prefects, tribunes, whole armies were successively employed to pursue a bishop and a fugitive. The vigilance of the civil and military powers was excited by the imperial edicts. Liberal rewards were promised to the man who should produce Athanasius, either alive or dead, and the most severe penalties were denounced against those who should dare to protect the public enemy. 38. But the deserts of Thebes were now peopled by a race of wild yet submissive fanatics who preferred the commands of their abbot to the laws of their sovereign. The numerous disciples of Antony and Pachonas received the fugitive primate as their father, admired the patience and humility with which he conformed to their strictest institutions, collected every word which dropped from his lips as the genuine effusions of inspired wisdom, and persuaded themselves that their prayers, their fasts, and their vigils were less meritorious than the zeal which they expressed, and the dangers which they braved, in the defense of truth and innocence. Ch.21. The monasteries of Egypt were seated in lonely and desolate places, on the summit of mountains or in the islands of the Nile, and the sacred horn or trumpet of Tabena was the well-known signal which assembled several thousand robust and determined monks, who, for the most part, had been the peasants of the adjacent country. When their dark retreats were invaded by a military force, which it was impossible to resist, they silently stretched out their necks to the executioner and supported their national character that tortures could never wrest from an Egyptian the confession of a secret which he was resolved not to disclose. 40. The Archbishop of Alexandria, for whose safety they eagerly devoted their lives, was lost among a uniform and well-disciplined multitude, and on the nearer approach of danger he was swiftly removed by their officious hands from one place of concealment to another, till he reached the formidable deserts which the gloomy and credulous temper of superstition had peopled with daemons and savage monsters. The retirement of Athanasius, which ended only with the life of Constantius, was spent for the most part in the society of the monks, who faithfully served him as guards, as secretaries, and as messengers. But the importance of maintaining a more intimate connection with the Catholic party tempted him, whenever the diligence of the pursuit was abated, to emerge from the desert, to introduce himself into Alexandria, and to trust his person to the discretion of his friends and adherents. His various adventures might have furnished the subject of a very entertaining romance. He was once secreted in a dry cistern which he had scarcely left before he was betrayed by the treachery of a female slave, 141, and he was once concealed in a still more extraordinary asylum, the house of a virgin, only 20 years of age, and who was celebrated in the whole city for her exquisite beauty. At the hour of midnight, as she related the story many years afterwards, she was surprised by the appearance of the archbishop in a loose undress, who, advancing with hasty steps, conjured her to afford him the protection which he had been directed by a celestial vision to seek under her hospitable roof. The pious maid accepted and preserved the sacred pledge which was entrusted to her prudence and courage. Without imparting the secret to anyone, she instantly conducted Athanasius into her most secret chamber, and watched over his safety with the tenderness of a friend and the assiduity of a servant. As long as the danger continued, she regularly supplied him with books and provisions, washed his feet, managed his correspondence, and dexterously concealed from the eye of suspicion this familiar and solitary intercourse between a saint whose character required the most unblemished chastity and a female whose charms might excite the most dangerous emotions. 42. During the 6 years of persecution and exile, Athanasius repeated his visits to his fair and faithful companion, and the formal declaration that he saw the councils of Rimini and Seleucia 43 forces us to believe that he was secretly present at the time and place of their convocation. The advantage of personally negotiating with his friends and of observing and improving the divisions of his enemies might justify, in a prudent statesman, so bold and dangerous an enterprise, and Alexandria was connected by trade and navigation with every seaport of the Mediterranean. From the depth of his inaccessible retreat, the intrepid primate waged an incessant and offensive war against the protector of the Arians, and his seasonable writings, which were diligently circulated and eagerly perused, contributed to unite and animate the Orthodox party. In his public apologies, which he addressed to the emperor himself, he sometimes affected the praise of moderation, whilst at the same time, in secret and vehement invectives, he exposed Constantius as a weak and wicked prince, the executioner of his family, the tyrant of the republic, and the Antichrist of the Church. In the height of his prosperity, the victorious monarch, who had chastised the rashness of Gallus and suppressed the revolt of Silvanus, who had taken the diadem from the head of Vetranio and vanquished in the field the legions of Magnentius, received from an invisible hand a wound which he could neither heal nor revenge, and the son of Constantine was the first of the Christian princes who experienced the strength of those principles which, in the cause of religion, could resist the most violent exertions 144 of the civil power. 1371 Evan, return. These princes were called Aezanas and Cyazanas. Athanasius calls them the kings of Aksum. In the superscription of his letter, Constantius gives them no title. Misdecryption of his letter. Salt, during his first journey in Ethiopia in 1806, discovered in the ruins of Axum a long and very interesting inscription relating to these princes. It was erected to commemorate the victory of Iazanas over the Bugatai. St. Martin considers them the Blemies, whose true name is Bedja or Bodja. Iazanas is styled king of the Axumites, the Homerites of Radan, of the Ethiopians, of the Sabsutites, of Silia, of Tiamo, of the Bugites, and of Kai. It appears that at this time the king of the Ethiopians ruled over the Homerites, the inhabitants of Yemen. He was not yet a Christian, as he calls himself son of the invincible Mars. Another brother besides Iazanas, named Adiphaz, is mentioned, though Iazanas seems to have been sole king. See St. Martin, note on Lebeau 251, Salt's Travels. De Sacy, note in Annales de Voyages, 12p. 53, M138, Return Pinto Orbe Profrugus, Athanasius, Nec Ulus, Caetutus ad latendum, supererat locus, tribuni, praefecti, comites, exercitus quocad, per vestigandum cum moventur, edictis, imperialibus, praemia delatoribus, proponuntur, sequis, ium vivum, si id minus, caput sote athacasi detulicit, Rufin, LIC 16, 139's Ord Return Gregor, Nazianzen, Tom, I, Orat, 21, p. 384, 3085, C. Tillemont, Mem. Eccles, Tom, 80p. 76 to 4110, 820, 830, 40 1790 Return, Alda tormentorum bis invenari, aduc potuit, quae obdurato ilius tractus latroni invito elicere potuit, ut nomen proprium dicat Amian. XXI, 15, and Valesius ad locum, 41, Return. LIC 10, Sozomen, L4C, 10. This and the following story will be rendered impossible if we suppose that Athanasius always inhabited the asylum which he accidentally or occasionally had used. 222, Return. Palladius, Hist, Loziac. C. 36 in Viti, Patrum, p. 7076. The original author of this anecdote had conversed with the damsel, who in her old age still remembered with pleasure so pious and honorable a connection. I cannot indulge the delicacy of Baronius, Valesius, Tillemont, and C., who almost reject a story so unworthy as they deem it of the gravity of ecclesiastical history. To 43 Return, to 43 Return, to 43 Return, I. Athanas, Tom. I agree with Tillemont, to 43 I, to 44997, that his expressions imply a personal, though perhaps secret, visit to the synods, to 44 I Return. The epistle of Athanasius to the monks is filled with reproaches which the public must feel to be true, Vol. III, p. 83-4, 85-6, and, in compliment to his readers, he has introduced the comparisons of Pharaoh, Ahab, Belshazzar, and C. The boldness of Hilary was attended with less danger if he published his invective in Gaul after the revolt of Julian, but Lucifer sent his libels to Constantius and almost challenged the reward of martyrdom. See Tillemont, Tom. 7, p. 9-5. The persecution of Athanasius and of so many respectable bishops who suffered for the truth of their opinions, or at least for the integrity of their conscience, was a just subject of indignation and discontent to all Christians, except those who were blindly devoted to the Arian faction. The people regretted the loss of their faithful pastors, whose banishment was usually followed by the intrusion of a stranger 145 into the episcopal chair, and loudly complained that the right of election was violated and that they were condemned to obey a mercenary usurper whose person was unknown and whose principles were suspected. The Catholics might prove to the world that they were not involved in the guilt and heresy of their ecclesiastical governor by publicly testifying their dissent or by totally separating themselves from his communion. The first of these methods was invented at Antioch and practiced with such success that it was soon diffused over the Christian world. The doxology or sacred hymn, which celebrates the glory of the Trinity, is susceptible of very nice but material inflections, and the substance of an orthodox or an heretical creed may be expressed by the difference of a disjunctive or a copulative particle. Alternate responses and a more regular psalmody, 14:6, were introduced into the public service by Flavianus and Diodorus, two devout and active laymen who were attached to the Nicene faith. Under their conduct, a swarm of monks issued from the adjacent desert. Bands of well-disciplined singers were stationed in the Cathedral of Antioch. The glory to the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. 47 was triumphantly chanted by a full chorus of voices, and the Catholics insulted by the purity of their doctrine the Arian prelate who had usurped the throne of the venerable Eustathius. The same zeal which inspired their psalms prompted the more scrupulous members of the Orthodox party to form separate assemblies, which were governed by the presbyters, till the death of their exiled bishop allowed the election and consecration of a new episcopal pastor. 14:8. The revolutions of the court multiplied the number of pretenders, and the same city was often disputed, under the reign of Constantius, by 2 or 3 or even 4 bishops, who exercised their spiritual jurisdiction over their respective followers and alternately lost and regained the temporal possessions of the Church. The abuse of Christianity introduced into the Roman government new causes of tyranny and sedition. The bands of civil society were torn asunder by the fury of religious factions, and the obscure citizen, who might calmly have surveyed the elevation and fall of successive emperors, imagined and experienced that his own life and fortune were connected with the interests of a popular ecclesiastic. The example of the two capitals, Rome and Constantinople, may serve to represent the state of the empire and the temper of mankind under the reign of the sons of Constantine. 45 return. Athanasius Tom, IEP 801, complains in general of this practice, which he afterwards exemplifies Trom. 861 in the pretended election of Felix. 3 eunuchs represented the Roman people, and 3 prelates who followed the court assumed the functions of the bishops of the suburbicarian provinces. 146 returned to Thomasin Discipline de l'Église, Tom. IL2C 7273p 966-984 has collected many curious facts concerning the origin and progress of church singing, both in the East and West. Note. Arius appears to have been the first who availed himself of this means of impressing his doctrines on the popular ear. He composed songs for sailors, millers, and travelers, and set them to common airs, beguiling the ignorant by the sweetness of his music into the impiety of his doctrines. Philostorgius 2. Arian singers used to parade the streets of Constantinople by night, till Chrysostom arrayed against them a band of orthodox choristers. Sozomen 8:8. Me 9, F147, return Philostorgius, L3C F13. Godefroy has examined this subject with singular accuracy, p. 47 and INC. There were 3 heterodox forms, to the Father by the Son, die and I in the Holy Ghost, to the Father and the Son in the Holy Ghost, and to the Father in the Son and the Holy Ghost. 48 return. After the exile of Eustathius under the reign of Constantine, the rigid party of the Orthodox formed a separation which afterwards degenerated into a schism and lasted about 80 years. See Tillemont, Meme, Eccles, Tom, v. 3554, 1137-1158, Tom, VII, p. 5037, 632, 3032. In many churches, the Arians and Homoousians, who had renounced each other's communion, continued for some time to join in prayer. Philostorgius, L30c, a 14ai, the Roman pontiff, as long as he maintained his station and his principles, was guarded by the warm attachment of a great people, and could reject with scorn the prayers, the menaces, and the oblations of an heretical prince. When the eunuchs had secretly pronounced the exile of Liberius, the well-grounded apprehension of a tumult engaged them to use the utmost precautions in the execution of the sentence. The capital was invested on every side, and the prefect was commanded to seize the person of the bishop either by stratagem or by open force. The order was obeyed, and Liberius, with the greatest difficulty, at the hour of midnight, was swiftly conveyed beyond the reach of the Roman people, before their consternation was turned into rage. As soon as they were informed of his banishment into Thrace, a general assembly was convened, and the clergy of Rome bound themselves, by a public and solemn oath, never to desert their bishop, never to acknowledge the usurper Felix, who, by the influence of the eunuchs, had been irregularly chosen and consecrated within the walls of a profane palace. At the end of 2 years, their pious obstinacy subsisted entire and unshaken. And when Constantius visited Rome, he was assailed by the importunate solicitations of a people who had preserved, as the last remnant of their ancient freedom, the right of treating their sovereign with familiar insolence. The wives of many of the senators and most honorable citizens, after pressing their husbands to intercede in favor of Liberius, were advised to undertake a commission which in their hands would be less dangerous and might prove more successful. The emperor received with politeness these female deputies, whose wealth and dignity were displayed in the magnificence of their dress and ornaments. He admired their inflexible resolution of following their beloved pastor to the most distant regions of the earth, and consented that the 2 bishops, Liberius and Felix, should govern in peace their respective congregations. But the ideas of toleration were so repugnant to the practice, and even to the sentiments of those times, that when the answer of Constantius was publicly read in the circus of Rome, so reasonable a project of accommodation was rejected with contempt and ridicule. The eager vehemence which animated the spectators in the decisive moment of a horse race was now directed towards a different object, and the circus resounded with the shout of thousands who repeatedly exclaimed, "One God, one Christ, one bishop." The zeal of the Roman people in the cause of Liberius was not confined to words alone, and the dangerous and bloody sedition which they excited soon after the departure of Constantius determined that prince to accept the submission of the exiled prelate and to restore him to the undivided dominion of the capital. After some ineffectual resistance, his rival was expelled from the city by the permission of the emperor and the power of the opposite faction. The adherents of Felix were inhumanly murdered in the streets, in the public places, in the baths, and even in the churches, and the face of Rome, upon the return of a Christian bishop, renewed the horrid image of the massacres of Marius and the proscriptions of Sylla. 49. Return. See, on this ecclesiastical revolution of Rome, Ammianus, 15 Sic. Notwithstanding the rapid increase of Christians under the reign of the Flavian family, Rome, Alexandria, and the other great cities of the empire still contained a strong and powerful faction of infidels who envied the prosperity and who ridiculed, even in their theaters, the theological disputes of the Church. Constantinople alone enjoyed the advantage of being born and educated in the bosom of the faith. The capital of the East had never been polluted by the worship of idols, and the whole body of the people had deeply imbibed the opinions, the virtues, and the passions which distinguished the Christians of that age from the rest of mankind. After the death of Alexander, the episcopal throne was disputed by Paul and Macedonius. By their zeal and abilities they both deserved the eminent station to which they aspired, and if the moral character of Macedonius was less exceptionable, his competitor had the advantage of a prior election and a more orthodox doctrine. His firm attachment to the Nicene Creed, which has given Paul a place in the calendar among saints and martyrs, exposed him to the resentment of the Arians. In the space of 14 years he was 5 times driven from his throne, to which he was more frequently restored by the violence of the people than by the permission of the prince, and the power of Macedonius could be secured only by the death of his rival. The unfortunate Paul was dragged in chains from the sandy deserts of Mesopotamia to the most desolate places of Mount Taurus, 150 confined in a dark and narrow dungeon, left 6 days without food, and at length strangled by the order of Philip, one of the principal ministers of the Emperor Constantius. Number 51. The first blood which stained the new capital was spilt in this ecclesiastical contest, and many persons were slain on both sides in the furious and obstinate seditions of the people. The commission of enforcing a sentence of banishment against Paul had been entrusted to Hermogenes, the master general of the cavalry, but the execution of it was fatal to himself. The Catholics rose in the defense of their bishop. The palace of Hermogenes was consumed. The first military officer of the empire was dragged by the heels through the streets of Constantinople, and, after he expired, his lifeless corpse was exposed to their wanton insults. 152. The fate of Hermogenes instructed Philip, the Praetorian prefect, to act with more precaution on a similar occasion. In the most gentle and honorable terms, he required the attendance of Paul in the baths of Zeuxippus, which had a private communication with the palace and the sea. A vessel which lay ready at the garden stairs immediately hoisted sail, and, while the people were still ignorant of the meditated sacrilege, their bishop was already embarked on his voyage to Thessalonica. They soon beheld, with surprise and indignation, the gates of the palace thrown open, and the usurper Macedonius seated by the side of the prefect on a lofty chariot, which was surrounded by troops of guards with drawn swords. The military procession advanced towards the cathedral. The Arians and the Catholics eagerly rushed to occupy that important post, and 3,150 persons lost their lives in the confusion of the tumult. Macedonius, who was supported by a regular force, obtained a decisive victory, but his reign was disturbed by clamor and sedition, and the causes which appeared the least connected with the subject of dispute were sufficient to nourish and to kindle the flame of civil discord. As the chapel in which the body of the great Constantine had been deposited was in a ruinous condition, the bishop transported those venerable remains into the church of St. Acacius. This prudent and even pious measure was represented as a wicked profanation by the whole party which adhered to the Homoousian doctrine. The factions immediately flew to arms, the consecrated ground was used as their field of battle, and one of the ecclesiastical historians has observed as a real fact, not as a figure of rhetoric, that the well before the church overflowed with a stream of blood, which filled the porticos and the adjacent courts. The writer who should impute these tumults solely to a religious principle would betray a very imperfect knowledge of human nature. Yet it must be confessed that the motive which misled the sincerity of zeal and the pretense which disguised the licentiousness of passion suppressed the remorse which, in another cause, would have succeeded to the rage of the Christians at Constantinople. 153. 150. Return. Cucusus was the last stage of his life and sufferings. The situation of that lonely town on the confines of Cappadocia, Cilicia, and the Lesser Armenia has occasioned some geographical perplexity, but we are directed to the true spot by the course of the Roman road from Caesarea to Anazarbus. See Solari Geograph. 2 p. 213, Wessling ad itinera, p. 7973, Numbilicesis 2-1 return, Athanasius 2, 813, 813, 813, affirms in the most positive terms that Paul was murdered, and appeals not only to common fame but even to the unsuspicious testimony of Philagrius, one of the Arian persecutors. Yet he acknowledges that the heretics attributed to disease the death of the bishop of Constantinople. Athanasius is servilely copied by Socrates, L2c 26, but Sozomen, who discovers a more liberal temper, presumes ill foresight too to insinuate a prudent doubt. 252 return, Ammianus Ixif. 10 refers to his own account of this tragic event, but we no longer possess that part of his history. Note, the murder of Hermogenes took place at the first expulsion of Paul from the See of Constantinople. M53 return, see Socrates and Sozomen. The Acts of St. Paul of Constantinople, of which Photius has made an abstract, Phot, Bibliot, p. 4019, 4030, are an indifferent copy of these historians, but a modern Greek, who could write the life of a saint without adding fables and miracles, is entitled to some commendation. Chapter 21, Persecution of Heresy, State of the Church. Part 7. The cruel and arbitrary disposition of Constantius, which did not always require the provocations of guilt and resistance, was justly exasperated by the tumults of his capital and the criminal behavior of a faction which opposed the authority and religion of their sovereign. The ordinary punishments of death, exile, and confiscation were inflicted with partial vigor, and the Greeks still revere the holy memory of two clerks, a reader and a subdeacon, who were accused of the murder of Hermogenes and beheaded at the gates of Constantinople. By an edict of Constantius against the Catholics, which has not been judged worthy of a place in the Theodosian Code, those who refused to communicate with the Arian bishops, and particularly with Macedonius, were deprived of the immunities of ecclesiastics and of the rights of Christians. They were compelled to relinquish the possession of the churches, and were strictly prohibited from holding their assemblies within the walls of the city. The execution of this unjust law in the provinces of Thrace and Asia Minor was committed to the zeal of Macedonius. The civil and military powers were directed to obey his commands, and the cruelties exercised by this semi-Arian tyrant in the support of the Homoious Aetian exceeded the commission and disgraced the reign of Constantius. The sacraments of the Church were administered to the reluctant victims who denied the vocation and abhorred the principles of Macedonius. The rites of baptism were conferred on women and children, who, for that purpose, had been torn from the arms of their friends and parents. The mouths of the communicants were held open by a wooden engine, while the consecrated bread was forced down their throat. The breasts of tender virgins were either burnt with red-hot eggshells or inhumanly compressed between harp and heavy boards. 54. The Novatians of Constantinople and the adjacent country, by their firm attachment to the Homoousian standard, deserve to be confounded with the Catholics themselves. Macedonius was informed that a large district of Paphlagonia 55 was almost entirely inhabited by those sectaries. He resolved either to convert or to extirpate them, and as he distrusted, on this occasion, the efficacy of an ecclesiastical mission, he commanded a body of 4,000 legionaries to march against the rebels and to reduce the territory of Mantineum under his spiritual dominion. The Novatian peasants, animated by despair and religious fury, boldly encountered the invaders of their country, and though many of the Paphlagonians were slain, the Roman legions were vanquished by an irregular multitude, armed only with scythes and axes, and, except a few who escaped by an ignominious flight, 4,000 soldiers were left dead on the field of battle. The successor of Constantius has expressed, in a concise but lively manner, some of the theological calamities which afflicted the empire, and more especially the East, in the reign of a prince who was the slave of his own passions and of those of his eunuchs. Many were imprisoned and persecuted and driven into exile. Whole troops of those who are styled heretics were massacred, particularly at Cyzicus and at Samosata. In Paphlagonia, Bithynia, Galatia, and in many other provinces, towns and villages were laid waste and utterly destroyed. In 561 return for return. Socrates, L22c, 27, 38. Sozomen, L4 Cor C 221. The principal assistants of Macedonius in the work of persecution were the two bishops of Nicomedia and Cyzicus, who were esteemed for their virtues and especially for their charity. I cannot forbear reminding the reader that the difference between the homoousion and homoousion is almost invisible to the nicest theological eye. Gender 55 return. We are ignorant of the precise situation of Mantineum. In speaking of these four bands of legionaries, Socrates, Sozomen, and the author of the Acts of St. Paul use the indefinite terms of, which Nicephorus very properly translates thousands, veils ad Socrat, L2c, 38. While the flames of the Arian controversy consumed the vitals of the empire, the African provinces were infested by their peculiar enemies, the savage fanatics who, under the name of circumcellions, formed the strength and scandal of the Donatist party. 15:7. The severe execution of the laws of Constantine had excited a spirit of discontent and resistance. The strenuous efforts of his son Constans to restore the unity of the Church exasperated the sentiments of mutual hatred which had first occasioned the separation, and the methods of force and corruption employed by the two imperial commissioners, Paul and Macarius, furnished the schismatics with a specious contrast between the maxims of the apostles and the conduct of their pretended successors. 258. The peasants who inhabited the villages of Numidia and Mauritania were a ferocious race who had been imperfectly reduced under the authority of the Roman laws, who were imperfectly converted to the Christian faith, but who were actuated by a blind and furious enthusiasm in the cause of their Donatist teachers. They indignantly supported the exile of their bishops, the demolition of their churches, and the interruption of their secret assemblies. The violence of the officers of justice, who were usually sustained by a military guard, was sometimes repelled with equal violence, and the blood of some popular ecclesiastics, which had been shed in the quarrel, inflamed their rude followers with an eager desire of revenging the death of these holy martyrs. By their own cruelty and rashness, the ministers of persecution sometimes provoked their fate, and the guilt of an accidental tumult precipitated the criminals into despair and rebellion. Driven from their native villages, the Donatist peasants assembled in formidable gangs on the edge of the Gaetulian desert and readily exchanged the habits of labor for a life of idleness and rapine, which was consecrated by the name of religion and faintly condemned by the doctors of the sect. The leaders of the Circumcellions assumed the title of captains of the saints. Their principal weapon, as they were indifferently provided with swords and spears, was a huge and weighty club, which they termed an Israelite, too, and the well-known sound of "Praise be to God," which they used as their cry of war, diffused consternation over the unarmed provinces of Africa. At first their depredations were colored by the plea of necessity, but they soon exceeded the measure of subsistence, indulged without control their intemperance and avarice, burnt the villages which they had pillaged, and reigned the licentious tyrants of the open country. The occupations of husbandry and the administration of justice were interrupted, and as the Circumcellions pretended to restore the primitive equality of mankind and to reform the abuses of civil society, they opened a secure asylum for the slaves and debtors who flocked in crowds to their holy standard. When they were not resisted, they usually contented themselves with plunder. But the slightest opposition provoked them to acts of violence and murder, and some Catholic priests who had imprudently signalized their zeal were tortured by the fanatics with the most refined and wanton barbarity. The spirit of the Circumcellions was not always exerted against their defenseless enemies. They engaged, and sometimes defeated, the troops of the province, and in the bloody action of Bargai they attacked in the open field, but with unsuccessful valor, an advanced guard of the imperial cavalry. The Donatists who were taken in arms received, and they soon deserved, the same treatment which might have been shown to the wild beasts of the desert. The captives died without a murmur, either by the sword, the axe, or the fire, and the measures of retaliation were multiplied in a rapid proportion which aggravated the horrors of rebellion and excluded the hope of mutual forgiveness. In the beginning of the present century, the example of the Circumcellions has been renewed in the persecution, the boldness, the crimes, and the enthusiasm of the Camisards, and if the fanatics of Languedoc surpassed those of Numidia by their military achievements, the Africans maintained their fierce independence with more resolution and perseverance. 59. Hinti 57 Return. See Optatus Milivitornus, particularly I. 4. With the Donatis History, by M. Dupin, and the original pieces at the end of his edition. The numerous circumstances which Augustine has mentioned of the fury of the Circumcellions against others and against themselves have been laboriously collected by Tillemont, Mem. Eccles, Tom, Vigi. p. 47. The without design exposed injuries which had provoked those fanatics. 58. Return. It is amusing enough to observe the language of opposite parties when they speak of the same men and things. Gratus, bishop of the same men and things. Gratus, bishop of Carthage, begins the acclamations of an orthodox synod. Gratius Deo omnipotenti et Christu Jesu, qui imperavit religiosissimo Constanti imperatori, ut votum gerat unitatis, et mitteret ministros sancti operis, famulos Dei Polum et Macarium. Monument. Veti ad calcem optati, p. 336, exe subito, says the Donatist author of The Passion of Marculus, de Constantis regif tyrannica domo. Pollutum Macarianae persecutionis murmur increpuit, et duabus besticis ad Africam missis, eodem silicet, Macario et Paulo, execrandum prosus ecdirum ecclesiae, certimen indictum est, ut populus Christianus ad unionem, cum traditoribus faciendam, nudatis militum gladius et draconum, presentibus signisi, et tubarum vocibus cogeretur. Monument. P. 3004, Faf return the Histoire de Camisards in 3 vols. 12 Most 1760 may be recommended as accurate and impartial. It requires some attention to discover the religion of the author. Such disorders are the natural effects of religious tyranny, but the rage of the Donatists was inflamed by a frenzy of a very extraordinary kind, and which, if it really prevailed among them in so extravagant a degree, cannot surely be paralleled in any country or in any age. Many of these fanatics were possessed with the horror of life and the desire of martyrdom, and they deemed it of little moment by what means or by what hands they perished if their conduct was sanctified by the intention of devoting themselves to the glory of the true faith and the hope of eternal happiness. 60 Sometimes they rudely disturbed the festivals and profaned the temples of paganism, with the design of exciting the most zealous of the idolaters to revenge the insulted honor of their gods. They sometimes forced their way into the courts of justice and compelled the affrighted judge to give orders for their immediate execution. They frequently stopped travelers on the public highways and obliged them to inflict the stroke of martyrdom by the promise of a reward if they consented, and by the threat of instant death if they refused to grant so very singular a favor. When they were disappointed of every other resource, they announced the day on which, in the presence of their friends and brethren, they should cast themselves headlong from some lofty rock, and many precipices were shown, which had acquired fame by the number of religious suicides. In the actions of these desperate enthusiasts, who were admired by one party as the martyrs of God and abhorred by the other as the victims of Satan, an impartial philosopher may discover the influence and the last abuse of that inflexible spirit which was originally derived from the character and principles of the Jewish nation. 60 Return. The Donatist suicides alleged in their justification the example of Rosius, which is related in the 14th chapter of the 2nd book of the Maccabees. The simple narrative of the intestine divisions which distracted the peace and dishonored the triumph of the Church will confirm the remark of a pagan historian and justify the complaint of a venerable bishop. The experience of Ammianus had convinced him that the enmity of the Christians towards each other surpassed the fury of savage beasts against man. 61 And Gregory Nazianzen most pathetically laments that the kingdom of heaven was converted by discord into the image of chaos, of a nocturnal tempest, and of hell itself. 62. The fierce and partial writers of the times, ascribing all virtue to themselves and imputing all guilt to their adversaries, have painted the battle of the angels and daemons. Our calmer reason will reject such pure and perfect monsters of vice or sanctity, and will impute an equal, or at least an indiscriminate, measure of good and evil to the hostile sectaries, who assumed and bestowed the appellations of orthodox and heretics. They had been educated in the same religion and the same civil society. Their hopes and fears in the present or in a future life were balanced in the same proportion. On either side, the error might be innocent, the faith sincere, the practice meritorious or corrupt. Their passions were excited by similar objects, and they might alternately abuse the favor of the court or of the people. The metaphysical opinions of the Athanasians and the Arians could not influence their moral character, and they were alike actuated by the intolerant spirit which has been extracted from the pure and simple maxims of the gospel. 61 Return. Nullus infestas hominibus bestias, ut sunt sibi ferales pleric Christianorum expertus. Ammian. 12. 5. A modern writer who, with a just confidence, has prefixed to his own history the honorable epithets of political and philosophical, 163 accuses the timid prudence of Montesquieu for neglecting to enumerate, among the causes of the decline of the empire, a law of Constantine, by which the exercise of the pagan worship was absolutely suppressed, and a considerable part of his subjects was left destitute of priests, of temples, and of any public religion. The zeal of the philosophic historian for the rights of mankind has induced him to acquiesce in the ambiguous testimony of those ecclesiastics who have too lightly ascribed to their favorite hero the merit of a general persecution. 64. Instead of alleging this imaginary law which would have blazed in the front of the imperial codes, we may safely appeal to the original epistle, which Constantine addressed to the followers of the ancient religion at a time when he no longer disguised his conversion nor dreaded the rivals of his throne. He invites and exhorts in the most pressing terms the subjects of the Roman Empire to imitate the example of their master. But he declares that those who still refuse to open their eyes to the celestial light may freely enjoy their temples and their fancied gods. A report that the ceremonies of paganism were suppressed is formally contradicted by the emperor himself, who wisely assigns as the principle of his moderation the invincible force of habit, of prejudice, and of superstition. Ch.21 55. Without violating the sanctity of his promise, without alarming the fears of the pagans, the artful monarch advanced, by slow and cautious steps, to undermine the irregular and decayed fabric of polytheism. The partial acts of severity which he occasionally exercised, though they were secretly promoted by a Christian zeal, were colored by the fairest pretenses of justice and the public good, and while Constantine designed to ruin the foundations, he seemed to reform the abuses of the ancient religion. After the example of the wisest of his predecessors, he condemned under the most rigorous penalties the occult and impious arts of divination, which excited the vain hopes and sometimes the criminal attempts of those who were discontented with their present condition. An ignominious silence was imposed on the oracles, which had been publicly convicted of fraud and falsehood. The effeminate priests of the Nile were abolished, and Constantine discharged the duties of a Roman censor when he gave orders for the demolition of several temples of Phoenicia, in which every mode of prostitution was devoutly practiced in the face of day and to the honor of Venus. 66. The imperial city of Constantinople was in some measure raised at the expense, and was adorned with the spoils, of the opulent temples of Greece and Asia. The sacred property was confiscated, the statues of gods and heroes were transported, with rude familiarity, among a people who considered them as objects, not of adoration but of curiosity. The gold and silver were restored to circulation, and the magistrates, the bishops, and the eunuchs improved the fortunate occasion of gratifying at once their zeal, their avarice, and their resentment. But these depredations were confined to a small part of the Roman world, and the provinces had been long since accustomed to endure the same sacrilegious rapine from the tyranny of princes and proconsuls who could not be suspected of any design to subvert the established religion. 167, 163, return. Histoire politique et philosophique des établissements des Européens dans les dieux, Indes, tome, EP 9. New 64, return. According to Eusebius, in Viti. Constantine. L2C 45, the emperor prohibited, both in cities and in the country, the abominable acts or parts of idolatry. L. Socrates, 17, and Sozomen, DL2. C. 4, 5, have represented the conduct of Constantine with a just regard to truth and history, which has been neglected by Theodoret LVC, 21, and Orosius, 7. 28, Tum Dinde, says the latter, Primus Constantinus adjusta ordine, et pio visem vertit edicto, siquidem statuit citra ullum hominum cadem, paganorum templa Claudi. 165, return. See Eusebius in Vitae. Constantin, Lee. C. 56, 60. In the Sermon to the Assembly of Saints, which the emperor pronounced when he was mature in years and piety, he declares to the idolaters, exi zish, that they are permitted to offer sacrifices and to exercise every part of their religious worship. In C. Eusebius, in Vish, Constantin, exdige, 23-25. These acts of authority may be compared with the suppression of the Bacchanals and the demolition of the Temple of Isis by the magistrates of pagan Rome. Isdc 7, return Eusebius in Vit, Constant, Lee, c. 54-58, and Libanius Orat. Pro Templis, p. 9-10, edit. Gothofrid, both mention the pious sacrilege of Constantine, which they viewed in very different lights. The latter expressly declares that he made use of the sacred money, but made no alteration in the legal worship. The temples indeed were impoverished, but the sacred rites were performed there. Lardner's Jewish and Heathen Testimonies, Vol. V. 140. The sons of Constantine trod in the footsteps of their father, with more zeal and with less discretion. The pretenses of rapine and oppression were insensibly multiplied. 168. Every indulgence was shown to the illegal behavior of the Christians, every doubt was explained to the disadvantage of paganism, and the demolition of the temples was celebrated as one of the auspicious events of the reign of Constans and Constantius. Chapter 3. Fictious events of the reign of Constantius. Point 69. The name of Constantius is prefixed to a concise law, which might have superseded the necessity of any future prohibitions. It is our pleasure that in all places and in all cities the temples be immediately shut and carefully guarded, that none may have the power of offending. It is likewise our pleasure that all our subjects should abstain from sacrifices. If anyone should be guilty of such an act, let him feel the sword of vengeance, and after his execution, let his property be confiscated to the public use. We denounce the same penalties against the governors of the provinces if they neglect to punish the criminals. Tabantenti. But there is the strongest reason to believe that this formidable edict was either composed without being published or was published without being executed. The evidence of facts and the monuments which are still extant of brass and marble continue to prove the public exercise of the pagan worship during the whole reign of the sons of Constantine. In the East as well as in the West, in cities as well as in the country, a great number of temples were respected or at least were spared, and the devout multitude still enjoyed the luxury of sacrifices, of festivals, and of processions by the permission or by the connivance of the civil government. About 4 years after the supposed date of this bloody edict, Constantius visited the temples of Rome, and the decency of his behavior is recommended by a pagan orator as an example worthy of the imitation of succeeding princes. That emperor, says Symmachus, suffered the privileges of the Vestal virgins to remain inviolate. He bestowed the sacerdotal dignities on the nobles of Rome, granted the customary allowance to defray the expenses of the public rites and sacrifices, and, though he had embraced a different religion, he never attempted to deprive the empire of the sacred worship of antiquity. 71. The Senate still presumed to consecrate by solemn decrees the by divine memory of their sovereigns, and Constantine himself was associated, after his death, to those gods whom he had renounced and insulted during his life. The title, the ensigns, the prerogatives of sovereign pontiff, which had been instituted by Numa and assumed by Augustus, were accepted without hesitation by 7 Christian emperors, who were invested with a more absolute authority over the religion which they had deserted than over that which they professed. 72. 16 Return. Ammianus Exae 4 speaks of some court eunuchs who were spolius templorum pasti. Libanius says ora, pro temple, p. 23. That the emperor often gave away a temple like a dog or a horse or a slave or a gold cup, but the devout philosopher takes care to observe that these sacrilegious favorites very seldom prospered. To 69. Return, see Gothofred, Cod, Theodos, Tom, vi, p. 262, Liban. Orat, parental cx in fabric, Bible. Greek Tom, VIP 23.5, 17 Return, paquit omnibus locis atque, abibus universis Claudi protinus empla, et accessu vetitis omnibus licentium delinquendi proditis abnegari. Volumus etiam cunctos abstineri, quod sequis aliquid forte, quadrus modi perpetraverit, gladios dernatur, facultates etiam perempti, fisco discernimus vindicari, et similiter ad fligi rectors provinciarum si facinora vindicare neglexerint, cod, Theodos, LXV, tit, ex leg. 4. Chronology has discovered some contradiction in the date of this extravagant law, the only one perhaps by which the negligence of magistrates is punished by death and confiscation. XVP, my evil bake. 98 conjectures, with a show of reason, that this was no more than the minutes of a law, the heads of an intended bill, which were found in Scriniae's Memoriae among the papers of Constantius, and afterwards inserted as a worthy model in the Theodosian Code. 171 return. Simac. Epistole. X54. 172 return. The fourth dissertation of M. de la Bastille sur le souverain pontificat de Empereurs Romains wa in the Mem. de la Car. Tom. XVS. p. 75. 144 is a very learned and judicious performance which explains the state and proves the toleration of paganism from Constantino to Gratian. The assertion of Zosimus that Gratian was the first who refused the pontifical robe is confirmed beyond a doubt, and the murmurs of bigotry on that subject are almost silenced. The divisions of Christianity suspended the ruin of paganism, 63, and the holy war against the infidels was less vigorously prosecuted by princes and bishops who were more immediately alarmed by the guilt and danger of domestic rebellion. The extirpation of idolatry 174 might have been justified by the established principles of intolerance, but the hostile sects, which alternately reigned in the imperial court, were mutually apprehensive of alienating and perhaps exasperating the minds of a powerful, though declining, faction. Every motive of authority and fashion, of interest and reason, now militated on the side of Christianity. But 2 or 3 generations elapsed before their victorious influence was universally felt. The religion which had so long and so lately been established in the Roman Empire was still revered by a numerous people, less attached indeed to speculative opinion than to ancient custom. The honors of the state and army were indifferently bestowed on all the subjects of Constantine and Constantius, and a considerable portion of knowledge and wealth and valor was still engaged in the service of polytheism. The superstition of the senator and of the peasant, of the poet and the philosopher, was derived from very different causes, but they met with equal devotion in the temples of the gods. Their zeal was insensibly provoked by the insulting triumph of a proscribed sect, and their hopes were revived by the well-grounded confidence that the presumptive heir of the empire, a young and valiant hero who had delivered Gaul from the arms of the barbarians, had secretly embraced the religion of his ancestors. 73 return. As I have freely anticipated the use of pagans and paganism, I shall now trace the singular revolutions of those celebrated words. 1. In the Doric dialect, so familiar to the Italians, signifies a fountain, and the rural neighborhood which frequented the same fountain derived the common appellation of pagus and pagans, festus sub voce and servius ad Virgil. Georgic, II, 3082, 2. By an easy extension of the word, pagan and rural became almost synonymous, plin, hist, nature, xxvi, 5, and the meaner rustics acquired that name, which has been corrupted into peasants in the modern languages of Europe. 3. The amazing increase of the military order introduced the necessity of a correlative term, Hume's Essays, Vol. A, pp. 555, and all the young people who were not enlisted in the service of the prince were branded with the contemptuous epithets of pagans, Tacit, Hist, Eii, 24, 43, 77, Juvenal, Satir, 16, Tertullian de Paleo, c. 4. The Christians were the soldiers of Christ. Their adversaries who refused his sacrament or military oath of baptism might deserve the metaphorical name of pagans, and this popular reproach was introduced as early as the reign of Valentinian, AD 365, into imperial laws, Cod. Theodos, LXV, Tit, Ei, Leg. 18, and theological writings. 5. Christianity gradually filled the cities of the empire, the old religion, in the time of Prudentius Advus, Simacum li ad fin, and Orosius in Prefat. Hist. retired and languished in obscure villages, and the word pagans, with its new signification, reverted to its primitive origin. 6. Since the worship of Jupiter and his family has expired, the vacant title of pagans has been successively applied to all the idolaters and polytheists of the Old and New World. 7. The Latin Christians bestowed it, without scruple, on their mortal enemies the Mahometans, and the purist Unitarians were branded with the unjust reproach of idolatry and paganism. See Gerard Vossius, Etymologicon Linguae Latinae, in his works Tom. IP 4220. Godefroy's Commentary on the Theodosian Code, Tom. VIP 250, and Ducange, Mediae et Infimae Latinitat, Glossar. 74. Return. In the pure language of Ionia and Athens were ancient and familiar words. The former expressed a likeness, an apparition, Homer, Odus, Ixai, 6I1, a representation, an image, created either by fancy or art. The latter denoted any sort of service or slavery. The Jews of Egypt, who translated the Hebrew scriptures, restrained the use of these words exod, xxod, xx. 4. 5. To the religious worship of an image. The peculiar idiom of the Hellenists, or Grecian Jews, has been adopted by the sacred and ecclesiastical writers, and the reproach of idolatry has stigmatized the visible and abject mode of superstition, which some sects of Christianity should not hastily impute to the polytheists of Greece and Rome.